Caleb Ward thought he'd buried his heart alongside his wife 3 winters ago, until the night he found a stranger cooking supper in his kitchen. The woman with bruised wrists and defiant eyes wasn't asking for mercy. She was bargaining for survival. But when a land baron's shadow stretches across the frontier, threatening to steal everything Caleb has left, this mysterious drifter will prove she's more than she appears. What begins as 3 borrowed days becomes a fight that will either destroy them both or forge something unbreakable from the ashes of their shattered pasts. Stay with me until the very end of this story. Hit that like button and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see just how far this tale travels across the frontier. The February wind cut through the Wyoming valley like a knife through worn leather, carrying with it the promise of snow and the weight of 3 years' silence. Caleb Ward urged his horse forward along the narrow trail that led home. If the cold shell of timber and stone he returned to each night could still be called that. The mare beneath him, a sturdy buckskin named Sable, knew the path better than he did these days, picking her way through the frozen creek bed while Caleb's mind wandered to places he'd spent 3 years trying to forget. His wife Sarah's face still haunted the corners of his vision sometimes, appearing in the curve of distant hills or the way evening light fell across the meadow grass. She'd been gone since the fever took her in the winter of 1871, and Caleb had let everything she'd loved about their ranch die with her. The garden she'd tended lay choked with weeds. The fence posts she'd painted white had grayed and splintered. The hope they'd built together had simply stopped. At 42, Caleb Ward was a man carved down to essentials. 6 feet of weathered muscle and sun-darkened skin, with hands scarred from a lifetime of hard work and eyes the color of storm clouds over the mountains. His dark hair had begun showing silver at the temples, and lines had settled deep around his mouth, not from smiling, but from the habit of keeping words locked behind his teeth. 3 years of near solitude had made him more comfortable with silence than conversation, more at ease with his horse and the wind than with the sound of human voices. He'd spent the past week in town, a collection of buildings called Clearwater, that sat 20 miles east of his property. Not because he'd wanted to, but because his supplies had run low enough that even he couldn't ignore it anymore. The trip had been its usual exercise in polite distance. Merchants who knew better than to ask how he was doing, neighbors who'd learned that sympathy only made him retreat further. He'd bought flour, coffee, ammunition, and a new axe head to replace the one he'd cracked in November. Then he'd left before anyone could mistake his presence for sociability. The sun was setting as Sable climbed the last rise before the homestead came into view. Caleb had built the cabin himself 12 years ago when he and Sarah had first claimed this land. Set in a natural clearing where the valley opened up between 2 ridges of pine and granite, it commanded a view of the creek that ran year-round and the meadow that had once produced enough hay to see their livestock through the hardest winters. The barn stood 50 yards from the main house, weathered but solid, though these days it held more emptiness than animals. Just Sable and 2 aging cattle he kept more out of habit than necessity. Caleb crested the ridge and pulled Sable to a stop, his breath catching in his chest. Smoke rose from his chimney. For a moment he simply stared, convinced the gathering darkness was playing tricks on his eyes. But no. A thin gray column climbed steadily into the twilight sky, and warm light glowed behind the cabin's front window. Someone was inside his house. His hand moved automatically to the rifle secured to his saddle. In 3 years of living alone, he'd never come home to find his cabin occupied. Drifters occasionally passed through this territory, and while most were harmless folks looking for work or passage west, some weren't. A man living alone, miles from town, made an easy target for those inclined toward theft or worse. Caleb urged Sable forward, approaching the cabin at an angle that would give him a clear view through the front window while keeping him partially concealed by the barn. The buckskin mare sensed his tension and moved quietly, her hooves nearly silent on the frozen ground. As they drew closer, Caleb caught glimpses of movement through the window, a figure moving with purpose between the table and the fireplace. He dismounted 20 feet from the front door, tied Sable to the hitching post with a quick-release knot, and drew his rifle. The weapon felt familiar in his hands, an extension of his own wariness. He crossed the distance to the cabin door in 4 long strides, then stopped and listened. The sound that reached him was so unexpected he nearly lowered the rifle. Someone was humming. Not a man's rough approximation of a tune, but a woman's voice, clear and unselfconscious, carrying a melody he half recognized from church services he hadn't attended in years. The absurdity of it, a stranger breaking into his home and humming while doing it, almost made him laugh. Almost. Caleb shifted his weight, making the porch boards creak deliberately. The humming stopped. A pause, and then footsteps approached the door from inside. The latch lifted, and the door swung open. A woman stood in the doorway, backlit by the fire behind her. She was younger than him, perhaps 30, with dark hair pulled back in a practical braid and eyes that assessed him with the same careful attention he was giving her. She wore a man's work shirt, patched at the elbows, and canvas trousers tucked into boots that had seen better days. A faded bandana circled her neck, and he could see the edge of a bruise darkening her left wrist where the sleeve had ridden up. They stared at each other for a long moment. Caleb noticed three things in quick succession. First, that she showed no fear at the sight of his rifle. Second, that she'd positioned herself in the doorway in a way that kept him from seeing fully into the cabin. And third, that whatever she'd been cooking smelled better than anything he'd eaten in months. "You must be Caleb Ward," she said finally. Her voice was steady, with a hint of the South softening the edges of her words. Not deep Tennessee or Georgia, but something lighter, maybe Kentucky or Virginia. "And you must be the person who broke into my house," Caleb replied, not lowering the rifle. "The door was unlocked. That doesn't make it yours to walk through." "Fair point." She tilted her head slightly, studying him. "Are you going to shoot me, or are you going to let me explain why I'm here?" Caleb's finger stayed near the trigger guard, but something in her directness made him hesitate. She wasn't pleading or apologizing, wasn't trying to charm her way out of the situation, just stating facts and waiting to see what he'd do with them. "Start explaining," he said, "and step back from the door while you do it." She moved back without argument, giving him space to enter. Caleb stepped inside, rifle still ready, and swept his gaze across the interior of the cabin. Everything looked different, not ransacked or stolen, but lived in a way it hadn't been for 3 years. The table had been scrubbed clean. The dishes he'd left unwashed before his trip to town were stacked neatly beside the basin. The floor had been swept, and the cobwebs that had gathered in the corners were gone. The fire in the hearth burned steady and well-tended, and on the table sat a pot of what looked like rabbit stew, still steaming. "My name is Mara Whitfield," the woman said, positioning herself on the far side of the table. "I've been traveling west from Kentucky for the better part of 3 months. 2 days ago, my horse went lame about 5 miles from here. I was carrying what supplies I could and looking for shelter when I found this place." "Found it looking abandoned, you mean?" Mara's expression didn't change. "I knocked. No one answered. The door was unlocked, and there were no fresh tracks, no smoke, no signs of recent habitation. I made a judgment call." "Bad judgment." "Maybe." She glanced at the rifle, then back at his face. "But I'm not a thief, Mr. Ward. I haven't touched anything except what I needed to make the place livable, and I've replaced what I used." "That stew on the table?" "I trapped the rabbit myself this morning." "The wood in your fireplace?" "I split it from the deadfall behind your barn. If you want me to leave, I'll leave. But I'm asking for 3 days. 3 days to rest, tend to my horse, and figure out my next move. In exchange, I'll work. I can cook, clean, mend, handle livestock, whatever you need done. After 3 days, I'll be gone, and you'll never know I was here." Caleb studied her across the table. She held his gaze without flinching, and he found himself cataloging details he'd missed at first glance. The way she stood suggested someone accustomed to physical labor, balanced, grounded, ready to move quickly if needed. The bruise on her wrist was maybe 3 or 4 days old, fading from purple to yellow-green. Her hands were calloused, nails cut short, fingers stained with what looked like wood ash and soil. This wasn't some city woman playing at frontier life. This was someone who knew how to survive. 3 days, he said finally, lowering the rifle. "But we need to get some things straight. You sleep in the barn. I sleep here. You don't touch my personal things. There's a trunk under the bed. You stay out of it. You don't go through my papers. You don't ask questions about my business. And you don't assume we're friends just because I'm letting you stay. This is work for shelter. Nothing more. Understood?" "Understood." Mara's posture relaxed slightly. Thank you. Don't thank me yet. You haven't seen the barn. A ghost of a smile crossed her face. I've slept in worse. Caleb set the rifle aside but kept it within reach. You said your horse went lame. Where is it now? In your barn. I hope that's all right. I checked her leg. No break, just a bad strain. She needs rest and time to heal. He nodded. I'll look at her in the morning. For now, you might as well finish whatever you were doing with that stew before it burns. Mara moved back to the fireplace, stirring the pot with a wooden spoon she must have found in his poorly organized kitchen supplies. Caleb watched her work, unsettled by the simple domesticity of the scene. 3 years since anyone had cooked in this cabin. 3 years since the smell of food had filled these rooms with something other than his own rough attempts at sustenance. He'd forgotten what it felt like to come home to warmth and light, to the sound of another person moving through space that had become his private mausoleum. Have you eaten? Mara asked, not looking at him. Not since morning. Then sit. This is ready. Caleb hesitated, then moved to the table and sat in the chair that had been Sarah's. The wrongness of it hit him like a physical blow. This stranger serving food in his dead wife's place, filling the silence with her presence. But his stomach overruled his heart, and when Mara set a bowl of stew in front of him, he picked up the spoon and ate. It was good, better than good. The rabbit had been cooked until it fell off the bone, mixed with wild onions and some kind of root vegetable he didn't immediately recognize. She'd seasoned it with herbs that must have come from the dried bundles still hanging in the corner, Sarah's last garden, preserved 3 years ago and untouched since. I hope you don't mind, Mara said, settling across from him with her own bowl. I used some of the dried sage and thyme from those bundles. They were losing their potency. Caleb swallowed hard, not trusting his voice. He managed a nod and kept eating. They ate in silence for several minutes. Outside, full darkness had fallen, and the wind picked up, rattling the shutters. The fire crackled and settled. In the barn, Sable whinnied once, probably greeting Mara's lame horse. Small sounds, ordinary sounds, but they filled the cabin with a kind of life Caleb had almost forgotten existed. You can ask, Mara said finally, setting down her spoon. Everyone else does. Ask what? Where I'm going. Why I'm alone. What happened to give me this? She raised her wrist, displaying the bruise fully. Whether I'm running from something or toward something. Caleb met her eyes. I said I didn't want questions about my business. Same courtesy applies to yours. Something shifted in Mara's expression. Surprise, maybe, or relief. Not many men would say that. I'm not most men. I'm starting to see that. They finished eating and Mara began clearing the dishes. Caleb stood to help, but she waved him off. I said I'd work for my shelter. Let me. He relented, moving to the window and looking out at the darkness. Behind him, he heard the splash of water as she filled the basin, the clink of dishes being washed. Ordinary sounds from an extraordinary day. When had his life become so empty that a stranger doing dishes could feel momentous? The barn isn't in bad shape, Mara said, breaking the silence. A little drafty in the back corner, but I found some old canvas and patched it. There's hay in the loft, and room enough for me to set up a bedroll without getting in the way of the horses. There's a wool blanket in the chest there. Caleb gestured toward a battered trunk near the door. Winter nights get cold. You'll need it. I have my own, but thank you. She finished with the dishes and dried her hands on a cloth that had been lying unused for months. When she turned back to face him, the firelight caught the exhaustion in her eyes, the kind of bone-deep weariness that came from weeks or months of hard travel and harder choices. I meant what I said about 3 days, she told him. I'm not looking to impose or complicate your life. I just need a little time and space to figure out my next move. Caleb nodded. 3 days. Then you're gone. Then I'm gone. She collected a bundle from the corner, a worn saddlebag, and a bedroll tied with rope, and moved toward the door. She paused with her hand on the latch. Mr. Ward? What? Thank you for not shooting me. Despite himself, Caleb felt the corner of his mouth twitch. Night's not over yet. That ghost of a smile returned to her face. Fair enough. Good night, Mr. Ward. Caleb, if you're staying, even for 3 days, you might as well use my name. Good night, Caleb. She stepped out into the cold, pulling the door closed behind her. Caleb listened to her footsteps crossing the yard, then the creak of the barn door opening and closing. He stood at the window for a long moment, watching the dark shape of the barn against the darker night. Then he turned back to the cabin. His cabin, but somehow transformed by a few hours of someone else's presence. The clean floor, the washed dishes, the lingering smell of cooked food and wood smoke. The silence felt different now, not empty but waiting, as if the house itself had been holding its breath for 3 years and had finally exhaled. Caleb banked the fire for the night, checked that the door was latched, and moved to the bedroom. He sat on the edge of the bed and pulled off his boots, his mind turning over the strangeness of the evening. A woman named Mara Whitfield, traveling alone across the frontier, taking shelter in his abandoned-looking cabin and offering work in exchange for 3 days' rest. It should have felt like an intrusion, a violation of the careful isolation he'd built around himself. Instead, it felt like something he couldn't quite name. A crack in the ice, maybe, or the first green shoot pushing up through frozen ground. He lay back on the bed, still fully dressed except for his boots, and stared at the ceiling. Outside, the wind continued to rise, promising that snow before morning. He thought about the woman in his barn, wondered what had put that bruise on her wrist, and what had driven her west with such determination. Then he remembered his own words, no questions about her business, and pushed the thoughts away. 3 days. He could manage 3 days. In the barn, Mara Whitfield spread her bedroll in the loft and wrapped herself in the thin blanket she'd carried from Kentucky. Below, her horse, a chestnut mare named Copper, shifted in her stall, favoring the strained leg. Mara had told Caleb the truth about the horse, about the weeks of travel, about needing 3 days. But she hadn't told him everything. She hadn't mentioned the ranch her family had lost, or the man who'd stolen it using forged documents and false promises. She hadn't mentioned that she'd been tracking rumors and following leads westward, trying to find proof of what had been done to them and to countless others. And she definitely hadn't mentioned that the name Victor Hale, land speculator, fraud, destroyer of families, had been whispered in the saloon in Clearwater when she'd stopped there 2 days before finding Caleb's ranch. The same Victor Hale who'd ruined her family. The same Victor Hale who was apparently operating in this territory now, buying up land through methods she suspected were just as illegal as what he'd done in Kentucky. 3 days, she'd promised Caleb. But 3 days might be all she needed to find out if Hale was here, if he was using the same schemes, and if there was any way to finally make him pay for what he'd taken. She closed her eyes and listened to the wind, to the horses moving below, to the creak and settle of the barn around her. Tomorrow she would start earning her keep, would prove to the hard-eyed man in the cabin that she meant what she'd said about working, but she would also start looking, listening, piecing together whatever information she could find. 3 days. Everything could change in 3 days. The snow began to fall an hour before midnight, soft and steady, covering the ranch in white. In the cabin, Caleb lay awake, watching shadows move across the ceiling and trying not to think about how good it had felt to eat a meal he hadn't cooked himself. In the barn, Mara stayed awake too, her mind cataloging everything she'd learned about Caleb Ward in their brief interaction, his wariness, his grief, his fundamental decency despite the walls he'd built around himself. Neither of them slept well that night, though for different reasons. And neither of them could have known that this chance meeting, this collision of a grieving rancher and a woman seeking justice, would set in motion events that would reshape not just their lives, but the fate of every rancher in the territory. The frontier had a way of taking solitary souls and forcing them into unlikely partnerships. It had a way of turning strangers into allies, and allies into something more. But all of that was still to come. For now, there was just the snow, the darkness, and 2 people trying to figure out if 3 days of shared space would be a gift or a burden. Morning would come soon enough, and with it, the real work would begin. Dawn broke cold and clear, the snow from the night before having laid down a fresh 3 inches across the valley. Caleb woke to silence, the deep, muffled quiet that came after snowfall, and for a moment forgot about the woman in his barn. Then memory returned, and he sat up quickly, straining to hear any sound from outside. Nothing. Either she was still asleep, or she moved more quietly than he expected. He dressed quickly in the cold cabin, pulling on wool socks and the same work clothes he'd worn for days. His breath made small clouds in the air as he rekindled the fire, adding kindling until flames caught and began pushing back the morning chill. He put coffee on to boil, real coffee, not the chicory substitute he sometimes resorted to, and was measuring cornmeal for Johnny cakes when he heard the barn door open. Through the window, he watched Mara emerge into the blue-gray light of early morning. She'd already been up long enough to tend the horses. He could see fresh hay scattered in the corral, and both animals stood with their heads down, eating contentedly. She carried a wooden bucket and headed toward the creek, her breath trailing behind her in the cold air. By the time she returned with the bucket full of water, Caleb had the Johnny cakes cooking and the coffee ready. He heard her boots on the porch, a pause, then a soft knock. "It's open," he called. Mara entered, bringing cold air and the smell of snow with her. She set the bucket down near the door and glanced at the food cooking on the stove. "I was going to make breakfast," she said. "You made dinner. My turn." She accepted this with a nod and moved to warm her hands by the fire. Caleb noticed she'd changed clothes, same worn canvas trousers, but a different shirt, this one patched at the shoulder. Her braid was neater than it had been last night, and the exhaustion in her face had eased slightly. A night's sleep had done her good. "How's your horse?" Caleb asked, flipping a Johnny cake. "Better. The rest helped. I cleaned the stall and checked her leg again. The swelling's down. I'll look at it after breakfast. Sometimes what seems like a simple strain can hide something worse." "I'd appreciate that." They ate quickly, standing at the counter rather than sitting at the table. The Johnny cakes were serviceable, if not inspired, and the coffee was strong enough to chase away the morning cold. Caleb found himself hyper-aware of Mara's presence in the small space, the way she held her coffee cup with both hands, the careful distance she maintained, the fact that she didn't try to fill the silence with unnecessary conversation. When they finished, Mara washed the dishes without being asked, and Caleb retrieved his coat from the peg by the door. "Let's see that horse," he said. They crossed the yard together, their boots crunching through the fresh snow. The morning sun had broken over the eastern ridge, painting the world in shades of gold and white. In the barn, Copper stood in the stall Mara had clearly cleaned thoroughly. Fresh straw bedded deep, water bucket filled, a small pile of hay in the corner. Caleb approached the chestnut mare slowly, letting her catch his scent before touching her. She was a good animal, well cared for despite the obvious signs of hard travel. He ran his hands down her foreleg, feeling for heat or unusual swelling, then lifted the hoof and examined it carefully. "You're right about the strain," he said, setting the hoof down gently. "No infection, no crack in the hoof. Another week of rest should set her right." "A week?" Mara's voice was carefully neutral. "I thought 3 days— 3 days for you to stay was our agreement, but this horse needs more time than that. You can leave after 3 days if you want, but she shouldn't be ridden hard for at least another 4 or 5 beyond that." Mara was quiet for a moment. "I could walk." "You could, but it's a long way to wherever you're headed, and winter isn't done with us yet. We'll probably get 2 or 3 more storms before spring really settles in." She moved to Copper's head, stroking the mare's neck. "I don't want to impose." "You already said that. Look, you want to work for your shelter. There's plenty that needs doing around here. If you're willing to stay longer than 3 days, I could use the help. But if you need to move on, I won't stop you." Mara met his eyes. "Why are you offering this?" Caleb shrugged. "You're a good worker. The place needs attention I haven't been giving it. Seems practical." "Just practical?" He felt his jaw tighten. "What else would it be?" "I don't know. Maybe charity. Maybe loneliness. Maybe you feel sorry for the woman with bruises on her wrist." "I don't do charity. I'm fine with solitude, and I don't feel sorry for anyone who's still standing on their own 2 feet. Caleb's voice was harder than he intended. "You want to stay or not?" Mara studied him for a long moment, and he had the uncomfortable feeling she was seeing past the walls he'd built, down to truths he didn't want examined. Then she nodded. "I'll stay, until Copper's ready to travel, and I'll earn my keep." "Didn't doubt it." They stood there in the barn's dim interior, surrounded by the smell of hay and horses, and something settled between them. Not quite trust, but an understanding. They were 2 people who'd both been broken by life in different ways, both trying to put themselves back together in a world that didn't care much about individual suffering. If they could help each other in the process, even temporarily, there was no shame in that. All right then, Caleb said, breaking the moment. Let's get started. There's fence line that needs checking on the eastern pasture, and I want to see how much damage the winter did to the irrigation ditches before spring runoff starts. You know anything about fence repair? Enough to manage. Then grab those work gloves from the shelf there, and let's see what you're made of. What Caleb discovered over the next several hours was that Mara Whitfield was made of considerably sterner stuff than most people he'd encountered. She worked without complaint, kept pace with him as they walked the fence line, and proved surprisingly knowledgeable about ranch maintenance. When they found a section where 3 posts had rotted through and the wire sagged nearly to the ground, she assessed the damage with a practiced eye. Need to replace all 3 posts, she said, examining the wood. Wire's salvageable if we restring it properly. Agreed. You done this before? My family had a ranch in Kentucky. Small operation, but we ran cattle and grew hay. I learned fence repair before I learned to read. It was the first personal detail she'd volunteered, and Caleb noted it carefully. What happened to the ranch? Mara's expression closed. Lost it. That's all that matters. He recognized the tone, the same one he used when people asked about Sarah. Some losses were too fresh or too deep to talk about, even years later. He let the subject drop and moved on to marking the posts they'd need to replace. They worked through the morning and into early afternoon, only stopping when the sun had climbed high enough to start melting the snow and turning the ground muddy. By then they'd surveyed most of the eastern pasture and made a detailed list of repairs needed. Caleb was impressed despite himself. Mara didn't just see what was broken, she saw what could be improved, pointing out places where the fence line could be straightened or gates could be added to make moving livestock easier. You're thinking like this is your place, he observed as they walked back toward the cabin. Habit, she said. Hard to look at land and not see its potential. Even land that isn't yours? Especially then. When it's yours, you only see what you've lost or what you failed to do. Someone else's land, you can see it fresh. Caleb considered this, thinking about the 3 years he'd spent looking at his ranch and seeing only Sarah's absence, only the dreams that had died with her. Maybe so. They reached the cabin, and Mara excused herself to tend to the horses, while Caleb went inside to prepare a midday meal. He was slicing salt pork when he heard the sound of hoofbeats approaching from the direction of town. A rider appeared, young Charlie Brennan, son of the family that owned the ranch 3 miles south. The boy was maybe 16, all gangly limbs and nervous energy. He pulled his horse up in front of the cabin and dismounted in a rush. "Mr. Ward!" Charlie's face was flushed from the cold ride. "Pa sent me to find you. There's trouble in town." Caleb stepped onto the porch, Mara emerging from the barn at the same moment. "What kind of trouble?" "Man named Victor Hale. Showed up yesterday with a bunch of papers claiming he owns the land rights to half the ranches around Clearwater. Says he bought them legal from the territorial office, but nobody remembers selling anything. Sheriff's calling a meeting tonight at the saloon. Pa wanted to make sure you heard about it." The name hit Caleb with dull recognition. He'd heard it mentioned once or twice in town, always in the context of land speculation and questionable dealings. But he'd paid little attention, too wrapped up in his own isolation to care about wider territorial politics. He glanced at Mara and saw her face had gone pale, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. "Mara?" he said. "You all right?" She didn't answer immediately. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper, but it carried the weight of old rage and fresh recognition. "Victor Hale. He's here. You know him?" Mara's eyes met his, and in them Caleb saw something that chilled him more than the winter wind. Not fear, but a kind of terrible, focused determination. "He's the man who stole my family's ranch," she said. "And if he's using the same methods here that he used in Kentucky, every rancher in this territory is about to lose everything they own." The silence that followed Mara's words hung in the cold air like smoke. Charlie Brennan looked between them, confused by the sudden tension. Caleb's mind raced, connecting pieces he hadn't known were part of the same puzzle. Mara's bruised wrist, her solitary journey west, the careful way she'd avoided talking about why she'd lost her family's ranch. "You're sure it's the same man?" Caleb asked, his voice low. Mara's jaw was set like iron. Victor Hale isn't a common name, and the method Charlie just described, showing up with papers claiming legal ownership of land other people have worked for years, that's exactly what he did in Kentucky. He targets small ranchers, people without the resources to fight back in court. By the time anyone realizes the documents are fraudulent, he's already sold the land to someone else or leveraged it for loans. Charlie shifted uncomfortably. Pa said the papers look official, got stamps and signatures and everything. But Mr. Hale only arrived in the territory 2 months ago, and he's claiming he's owned these land rights for over a year. 2 months, Mara repeated, her voice bitter. Just enough time to set up his operation and identify his targets. How many ranches is he claiming? Pa counted at least 7, maybe more. He's got a lawyer with him, a slick-talking man from back east who keeps throwing around legal terms nobody understands. Sheriff Morrison doesn't know what to make of it. Caleb felt something stir in his chest, something that hadn't moved in 3 years. Anger, maybe, or a sense of purpose he'd thought had died with Sarah. These were his neighbors Hale was threatening, people who'd left him alone in his grief, but had never stopped being decent to him when their paths crossed in town. "What time's the meeting?" he asked. 7 o'clock. Pa said to spread the word to everyone within writing distance. Charlie glanced at the sun, calculating time. "I got 2 more ranches to visit before I head back. Tell your father I'll be there." Caleb paused, then added, "And tell him to make sure people bring any documents they have. Original land claims, titles, survey maps, anything that proves their ownership." Charlie nodded and swung back onto his horse. "Yes, sir, I'll tell him." He kicked the horse into motion, disappearing back down the trail toward the Brennan Ranch. Caleb turned to Mara. She was staring after the departed rider, her hands still clenched, her whole body radiating a fury she was barely containing. "How bad was it?" he asked quietly. "What Hale did to your family?" Mara closed her eyes briefly, and when she opened them again, they were wet, but no tears fell. "My father built our ranch from nothing, spent 30 years turning rocky Kentucky hill country into something that could support cattle and crops. It wasn't much, but it was ours. Then Hale showed up with a deed that claimed he'd purchased the land rights from the state 5 years earlier, which was impossible because my father had the original land grant from 1848. But Hale's documents looked official, and he had lawyers, and we didn't." "You fought him?" "My father tried, spent every dollar we had on a lawyer who turned out to be worse than useless. The judge ruled in Hale's favor because the forged deed had a notary seal, and our original land grant didn't. It had been filed before the territory required notarization. My father lost everything in 6 months, the ranch, the cattle, even the house we lived in. He died 8 months later. The doctor said it was his heart, but I know better. Hale killed him just as surely as if he'd put a bullet in him." Caleb felt the weight of her story settle around them. He understood that kind of loss, not the same as his, but parallel to it. The slow death of everything you'd built, everything you'd believed was solid and permanent. "That bruise on your wrist," he said. "That from Hale?" Mara's laugh was sharp and humorless. "From one of his men. I went to his office in Louisville after my father died, demanded to see the deed, demanded proof of his claim. He had me thrown out. One of his enforcers got rough about it. That was 3 months ago, right before I started following the rumors that Hale had moved his operation west. You've been tracking him." "I've been hunting him." The distinction in her voice was clear. "I knew if I could find where he was operating next, maybe I could stop him before he did to other families what he did to mine. And if I couldn't stop him, at least I could expose him." Caleb studied her face, seeing her fully for the first time. Not just a desperate woman seeking shelter, but someone driven by a purpose that had carried her across half the country alone. Someone who'd walked into his abandoned-looking ranch, not by accident, but because she'd been in Clearwater asking questions about Hale and had needed a place to think, to plan, to rest before the next confrontation. "You knew he was operating in this territory before you found my place," he said. "I heard his name mentioned in the saloon 2 days ago, but I didn't know the details until now. Didn't know he was already making his move." She met his eyes. "I'm sorry I wasn't fully honest with you about why I'm here, but I meant what I said about working for my shelter. And I meant what I said about leaving after 3 days, if that's what you want." "What I want," Caleb said slowly, "is to know what you think we can do about this. You said if he's using the same methods, every rancher is about to lose everything. Can we stop him? I don't know. In Kentucky, by the time we understood what was happening, it was too late. The legal system worked in his favor because his documents looked legitimate and ours looked old and questionable. But here we have advance warning, and if I'm right about how he operates, there's a flaw in his system. What kind of flaw? Mara's expression sharpened with the focus of someone who'd spent months thinking through every angle of this problem. Hale's forgeries are good, but they're not perfect. He uses stolen notary seals, usually from officials who are dead or retired, people whose signatures can't be easily verified. He also tends to use the same forger for multiple documents, which means there are patterns. Similar handwriting, similar phrasing in the legal language, similar types of paper and ink. If we can get our hands on multiple examples of his fraudulent deeds and compare them to legitimate documents from the territorial office, we might be able to prove they're fake. Might being the important word. It's better than nothing, and it's more than my father had. She paused, then added, I also know Hale's patterns. He doesn't file all his claims at once. He does it gradually, targeting the most vulnerable ranchers first, the ones who are isolated, who have the least resources, who are least likely to fight back effectively. Then he uses those early victories to legitimize his later claims. If we can stop him before he gets momentum, before he turns those first few ranches into proof of his legitimate ownership, we might have a chance. Caleb turned this over in his mind, thinking about the ranchers he knew in the territory. The Brennans were solid people with a good operation, but they weren't wealthy. Old Samuel Tucker ran a small spread to the north, barely making ends meet since his sons had gone to seek gold in California. The widow Hartley had been struggling to maintain her late husband's ranch for 2 years. If Hale was targeting the vulnerable first, these would be exactly the people he'd go after. The meeting tonight, he said. We need to go. We need to hear exactly what Hale's claiming and see those documents if we can. Agreed. But Caleb, Mara hesitated. If we do this, if we try to fight him, it won't be easy. Hale has money, lawyers, connections. He's probably already paid off local officials, or at least made sure they won't look too closely at his paperwork. And he's not afraid to use intimidation or worse to get what he wants. You saying we should just let it happen? No, I'm saying you need to understand what you're getting into. This isn't just helping a stranger fix some fences. This is going up against someone who's destroyed families, who's gotten away with fraud in multiple territories, who has everything to lose if he's exposed. Caleb looked out across his land, the snow-covered meadow, the creek running clear and cold, the fence line they'd walked that morning. Sarah had loved this place. They'd chosen it together, had planned to raise children here, to build something that would last beyond their own lives. He'd let it all fall into neglect after she died, but standing here now, hearing about Hale's threat to the whole territory, he felt something wake up inside him that had been sleeping for 3 years. I understand, he said, and I'm still going to that meeting. Relief flickered across Mara's face. Then we should prepare. We need to know exactly what questions to ask, what details to look for in those documents. And we need to be careful. If Hale realizes someone's actively investigating him, he'll accelerate his timeline or disappear and resurface somewhere else. They spent the afternoon in the cabin, Mara sketching out everything she knew about Hale's operation while Caleb listened and asked questions. She had a sharp mind for detail, able to recall specific elements of the forged deed that had stolen her family's ranch, the type of seal used, the official's name, the peculiar phrasing in the property description. She also knew the names of other families in Kentucky who'd lost land to Hale, and the pattern of how he'd moved through that territory. He's like a wildfire, she explained, drawing a rough map on a piece of paper. Burns through an area fast, takes what he can, then moves on before the authorities can organize a real response. By the time anyone realizes the scale of what he's done, he's already 3 territories away, operating under a slightly different name or through a proxy. So why come here? Wyoming territory isn't exactly the easiest mark. Land's cheaper than Kentucky, less developed. That's exactly why. Less developed means less organized record keeping, fewer people who know how to navigate the legal system, more opportunity for his forgeries to slip through. Plus, there's railroad money coming. Everyone knows the Union Pacific is going to expand their lines through here eventually. Land that's worth almost nothing now will be worth fortunes in 5 or 10 years. Hale's not just stealing ranches, he's positioning himself to profit from development that hasn't happened yet. The sophistication of it made Caleb's jaw clench. This wasn't some simple con man or claim jumper. This was organized fraud on a scale that most people couldn't even conceive of. As the sun began its descent toward the western mountains, they prepared to ride to Clearwater. Caleb saddled Sable while Mara checked on Copper one more time, making sure the mare had enough hay and water to last the evening. The injured horse wasn't fit to ride yet, so Mara would ride behind Caleb. Not ideal, but necessary. "One more thing," Mara said as they mounted up. "At the meeting, let me stay in the background. If Hale's there, I don't want him to recognize me. He saw me once in Louisville, and I'd rather keep the element of surprise if we end up needing it." Caleb nodded. "You'll be just another ranch hand then. Keep your hat low and don't speak unless you have to." They rode through the late afternoon light, following the trail that wound along the creek before climbing over the ridge toward Clearwater. The town came into view as the sun touched the mountain peaks, a modest collection of wooden buildings arranged along a main street with a few side roads branching off into residential areas. The saloon sat at the center of town, a two-story structure that served as the community's unofficial meeting hall for important gatherings. Horses crowded the hitching posts outside, and Caleb recognized most of them. The Brennans were already here, as were the Tuckers, the Hartleys, and at least a dozen other ranching families from the surrounding area. Light spilled from the saloon's windows, and the sound of anxious voices carried into the street. Caleb and Mara dismounted, and she pulled her hat down as promised, letting the brim shadow her face. They entered together, the warmth and noise of the packed room washing over them. Every table was occupied, and people stood along the walls, their faces tight with worry. Sheriff Morrison stood near the bar, a weathered man in his 50s who looked deeply uncomfortable with whatever was happening. But it was the two men at the front of the room who drew Caleb's attention. The first was youngish, maybe 35, dressed in an expensive suit that looked absurdly out of place in a frontier saloon. He had slicked back hair and the kind of confident posture that came from never having done a day of hard physical labor. The lawyer, Caleb assumed, Caleb. The second man was older, perhaps 50, with silver gray hair and a face that managed to look both distinguished and predatory. He wore a dark coat and vest, with a gold watch chain visible across his middle. When he smiled at something the lawyer said, it didn't reach his eyes. Victor Hale. Caleb felt Mara tense beside him. He didn't look at her, didn't want to draw attention, but he could feel the rage radiating from her like heat from a stove. 3 months of tracking, and she was finally in the same room as the man who'd destroyed her family. "Gentlemen, ladies," Sheriff Morrison called out, trying to bring order to the room. "Let's settle down so we can get through this. Mr. Hale here has some claims to present, and I want everyone to hear them out before we start making judgments." "Judgments?" Old Samuel Tucker's voice cracked across the room. "He's claiming he owns my land, Morrison. Land I've worked for 20 years. What judgment is there to make?" A murmur of angry agreement rippled through the crowd. Hale raised his hands in a placating gesture, his expression perfectly calibrated to convey understanding and regret. "I understand your distress, Mr. Tucker," Hale said, his voice smooth and cultured. "Truly I do. This situation is unfortunate for everyone involved, but I assure you my claims are entirely legal and properly documented. I have no desire to displace anyone unfairly. I'm here to find a reasonable solution that respects both your years of labor and my legitimate property rights." "Legitimate?" Mary Hartley stood up, her voice shaking. "How can you claim rights to land you've never even seen before 2 months ago?" The lawyer stepped forward, pulling papers from a leather satchel. "Mrs. Hartley, my name is Edmund Price, and I represent Mr. Hale's interests in this territory. The land rights in question were purchased by my client from the Wyoming Territorial Land Office over 18 months ago, long before his recent arrival here. The delay in asserting these rights was simply a matter of Mr. Hale attending to business interests elsewhere. Now that he's prepared to develop these properties, he's required by law to notify current occupants and arrange for transfer of possession." "Transfer of possession," Tom Brennan repeated, standing beside his son Charlie. "That's a fancy way of saying you're throwing us off our own land." "Not at all," Price said smoothly. "Mr. Hale is prepared to offer compensation for any improvements you've made. buildings, wells, fencing, and he's willing to discuss lease arrangements that would allow you to continue working the land under his ownership. At what price? Someone called out. Fair market rates, naturally. Which you'll set, Samuel Tucker said bitterly. Hale stepped forward again, his expression earnest. I'm not here to destroy livelihoods, I assure you. I'm a businessman, yes, but I'm also a reasonable man. I understand that this comes as a shock. That's why I'm proposing we handle this matter through proper legal channels, with mediation and fair assessment of all claims. Sheriff Morrison has agreed to facilitate a review process. I agreed to let you present your case, Morrison interrupted, his discomfort evident. I didn't agree to facilitate anything until I've seen proof these claims are legitimate. Of course, Sheriff, and I have that proof right here. Price began distributing papers to the people in the front row. These are certified copies of the land deeds, complete with territorial seals and signatures from the appropriate officials. As you'll see, everything is in order. Caleb watched as the documents made their way through the crowd. When one reached Tom Brennan, the rancher studied it with a frown, clearly out of his depth with the legal language. Others reacted similarly, confused, angry, but uncertain. These were people who knew cattle and crops and hard work, not contract law and property rights. A copy reached Caleb's hands, and he read it carefully, aware of Mara reading over his shoulder. The document certainly looked official. It claimed that Victor Hale had purchased land rights to several thousand acres from the territorial government in September of 1872, with the boundaries described in technical surveyor's language. At the bottom was a seal and a signature from someone named James Whitmore, identified as a territorial land commissioner. Mara's hand touched his arm briefly. A warning. A signal. She'd seen something. Caleb cleared his throat. Mr. Price, I have a question about these documents. The lawyer turned toward him with practiced patience. Of course, Mr. Ward. Caleb Ward. This deed is dated September 1872 and signed by James Whitmore. Was Mr. Whitmore the land commissioner at that time? He was indeed, served in that capacity from 1870 to 1873. And where is he now? Can he verify this transaction? Price's smile didn't waver. Unfortunately, Mr. Whitmore passed away last year, but his signature and seal are a matter of public record and have been authenticated by current territorial officials. Convenient, Caleb said quietly. Hale's eyes sharpened, focusing on Caleb with sudden interest. I'm sorry, is there something convenient about a man's death, Mr. Ward? That seems rather callous. What's convenient is that the man who supposedly authorized this land transfer is dead and can't be questioned about it. Are you suggesting my client forged these documents? Price's voice took on an edge. Because that's a serious accusation that could carry legal consequences for you. The room went quiet. Caleb felt the weight of everyone's attention and understood he was standing at a crossroads. He could back down, let Hale and his lawyer intimidate him into silence like they'd probably done to dozens of others. Or he could push forward, knowing it might paint a target on his back. He thought about Sarah, about the ranch they'd built together, about the neighbors who'd respected his grief and left him alone but had never stopped being decent people. He thought about Mara, standing silent beside him, carrying the weight of her father's death and her family's destroyed dream. I'm not suggesting anything, Caleb said. I'm asking questions. Like why a land commissioner would sell rights to land that was already claimed and occupied. Like how you expect us to believe these transactions happened 18 months ago when nobody here received any notification until now. Like why we should trust documents that can't be verified by the man who supposedly signed them. Hale's expression hardened, the genial mask slipping just enough to reveal something cold underneath. Mr. Ward, I understand you're upset. Change is difficult, especially for those who've grown comfortable in their circumstances. But the law is the law, and these documents are legal proof of my ownership. If you have evidence to the contrary, I suggest you present it through proper channels. Otherwise, I'm afraid your questions are simply delaying the inevitable. The inevitable being you taking land that doesn't belong to you? The inevitable being legal property rights being enforced, regardless of your personal feelings about it. The tension in the room ratcheted up several notches. Caleb saw Tom Brennan and several other ranchers moving closer, their body language shifting from anxious to protective. These were men who'd spent their lives working with their hands, Men who understood direct action better than legal maneuvering. If this escalated into violence, people would get hurt, and Hale would probably win anyway through the courts. Sheriff Morrison stepped between them, hands raised. All right, that's enough. Caleb, I understand your concerns, and they're not unreasonable. But Mr. Hale's right that this needs to be settled through proper legal review. I'm proposing we take a week to let everyone consult with lawyers, review these documents thoroughly, and gather any evidence of their own claims. Then we reconvene and figure out the truth of this matter. A week? Mary Hartley's voice cracked. What are we supposed to do in a week, Sheriff? Most of us can't afford lawyers, and even if we could, how do we fight documents that look this official? We find someone who knows how to check if they're real, Mara said quietly. Every head in the room turned toward her. Caleb felt his stomach drop as she pulled off her hat, revealing her face fully. So much for staying in the background. Hale's eyes widened in recognition. You. Me, Mara agreed, her voice steady. Hello, Victor. It's been a few months. You know this woman? Price asked his client. She's a troublemaker from Kentucky who made false accusations about my business there. I had to have her removed from my office for making threats. The only threat I made was to expose you for the fraud you are, Mara said, and I'm going to make good on that threat now. She walked forward, and the crowd parted for her. When she reached the front of the room, she took one of the documents from a confused rancher's hands and held it up. This deed is a forgery, she announced. I can't prove it tonight, but I can prove it if you give me time. The signature on this document is from James Whitmore, who died last year. That's true. What's also true is that Victor Hale has a history of using dead officials' signatures on forged deeds. He did it in Kentucky, and he's doing it here. The seal on this document was probably stolen from Whitmore's office after his death. And if we can find records of what Whitmore's actual signature looked like compared to this one, I'm betting we'll find discrepancies. You can't prove any of that, Price said. Not yet, but I know where to start looking. There's a land records expert in Cheyenne, a clerk who worked in the territorial office for 20 years and knows every official signature, every seal, every piece of documentation that's passed through that office. His name is Thomas Garrett, and he's helped expose land fraud before. If we can get these documents to him and compare them to the genuine article, he'll be able to tell us if they're real. Hale's face had gone pale, then flushed with anger. This is absurd. You're listening to a woman who's clearly unstable, who's been following me across territories making wild accusations. Because you stole my family's ranch, Mara cut him off. Because you destroyed my father's life with the exact same scheme you're trying to run here. And because I made a promise that I would stop you before you did it to anyone else. The room erupted into overlapping voices, questions, accusations, demands for answers. Sheriff Morrison tried to restore order, but the energy had shifted. People who'd been confused and frightened now looked at Hale with suspicion, and at Mara with hope. Caleb moved to stand beside her, a silent show of support. Tom Brennan and his son joined them, and then Samuel Tucker, and then Mary Hartley. One by one, the threatened ranchers formed a line of resistance that hadn't existed 5 minutes ago. Hale's eyes swept across them, and Caleb saw the calculation happening behind that gaze. The man was reassessing, adjusting his strategy on the fly, trying to decide whether to push forward or retreat. Sheriff Morrison, Hale said finally, his voice tight. I came here in good faith to handle this matter through proper channels. I'm being met with baseless accusations and mob mentality. I suggest we adjourn this meeting and reconvene when cooler heads can prevail. I suggest we take Mrs. Hartley's question seriously, Caleb said. We have 1 week. In that week, we're going to Cheyenne to see this records expert. We're going to find out if these deeds are legitimate or if you're running the same fraud you ran in Kentucky. And if they're fake, you're going to answer for it. Is that a threat, Mr. Ward? It's a promise. The two men stared at each other across the crowded room, and Caleb saw Hale fully for the first time, not the genial businessman or the wronged property owner, but the predator underneath. This was a man who'd built a fortune on other people's suffering, who'd perfected the art of legal theft, who saw human beings as obstacles to profit. 1 week, Sheriff Morrison said, making it official. We'll reconvene here in 7 days. In the meantime, nobody takes any action on these claimed properties. No evictions, no foreclosures, no changes to current occupancy. Agreed? Agreed, Hale said after a long pause. Though I want it noted that this delay is costing me considerable money and inconvenience. Noted, Morrison said dryly. Now I suggest everyone head home before this gets uglier. The meeting broke up slowly, people clustering in small groups to talk in hushed, urgent voices. Caleb found himself surrounded by neighbors he hadn't spoken to in months, all of them asking questions, offering support, trying to figure out what came next. Through the crowd, he saw Hale and Price leaving through the back door, and he saw the look Hale gave Mara as he departed, pure venom, mixed with something that might have been fear. The man knew he'd been recognized, knew his methods had been exposed. The question was what he'd do about it. Tom Brennan gripped Caleb's shoulder. You're really going to Cheyenne? I am. We are, Caleb corrected, glancing at Mara. Then some of us are going with you. This affects all of us, and we should face it together. Tom's right, Samuel Tucker added. Strength in numbers. And if this Garrett fellow can really prove those deeds are fake, we'll need witnesses. Caleb started to argue, then stopped. They were right. This wasn't just about his ranch or even Mara's revenge. This was about the whole community standing up to someone who thought he could steal from them with impunity. All right, he agreed. Tomorrow morning, anyone who can ride should meet at my place at first light. It's a 2-day journey to Cheyenne, maybe 3, depending on weather. Bring supplies for a week, just in case. The agreement made, people began filtering out into the cold night. Caleb and Mara were among the last to leave, stepping out into air that had turned bitter with the promise of more snow. They rode back toward the ranch in silence, both processing what had just happened. It wasn't until they were halfway home that Mara finally spoke. Thank you. For what? For standing with me. For believing me. For not backing down when Hale tried to intimidate you. Caleb kept his eyes on the dark trail ahead. I've spent 3 years alone, convinced that nothing mattered anymore. Tonight I remembered what it feels like to fight for something. Is that what Sarah would have wanted? For you to fight? He was quiet for a long moment. Sarah believed in community, in people helping each other, in standing up for what's right even when it's hard. She would have been in that room tonight arguing louder than any of us. So yeah, I think she'd want me to fight. Especially for this. They rode on through the darkness, and when they finally reached the ranch, the cabin looked different to Caleb than it had that morning. Not empty and hollow, but full of possibility. A base of operations. A gathering place for people who were finally ready to push back against someone who'd counted on their fear and isolation. Tomorrow they'd ride for Cheyenne. Tomorrow they'd start gathering the evidence they needed. But tonight, for the first time in 3 years, Caleb Ward felt like he was part of something larger than his own grief. And somewhere in the darkness behind them, Victor Hale sat in a rented room above the Clearwater Mercantile, planning his next move and deciding exactly how far he was willing to go to protect the empire he'd built on lies. The fight for the land had begun. Dawn came too early and too cold, the kind of February morning that made a man question why anyone had ever thought settling in Wyoming was a good idea. Caleb was already awake when the first gray light touched the eastern sky. Had been awake for hours, if he was honest. Sleep had come in fragments between long stretches of staring at the ceiling, his mind turning over everything that had happened in the saloon and everything that still lay ahead. He dressed quickly in the pre-dawn darkness and stepped out onto the porch to find Mara already moving through the yard, her breath making clouds in the freezing air. She'd saddled both horses and was checking the supplies they'd packed the night before. Dried meat, hardtack, coffee, blankets, and the precious documents Hale had distributed. Caleb had kept his copy, knowing they'd need it for comparison when they reached Cheyenne. Couldn't sleep either, he called out. Mara looked up, her face drawn but determined. Kept thinking about all the ways this could go wrong. That's a long list. I know. She finished checking Sable's saddle and moved to where Copper stood in the corral. The chestnut mare's leg looked better, the swelling almost gone, but Mara ran her hands down it anyway with the careful attention of someone who'd lost too much to take chances. Copper's improving, but she's still not ready for hard riding. I hate leaving her. She'll be fine here. We'll be back in less than a week. Mara nodded, but didn't look convinced. Caleb understood the reluctance. The horse represented her last connection to the life she'd left behind, the only possession she'd managed to hold on to through 3 months of hard travel and harder losses. Leaving Copper felt like abandoning a piece of herself. The sound of approaching horses drew their attention to the trail. Through the morning mist, riders emerged one by one. Tom Brennan and his son Charlie, Samuel Tucker on his elderly gray gelding, Mary Hartley with her ranch foreman, a hard-faced man named Dutch who'd worked for her late husband. Behind them came 3 more ranchers Caleb knew by sight, if not by name, and a young woman he didn't recognize at all. Tom dismounted first, his weathered face serious. "Hope you meant what you said about riding together, because we're here and we're ready." "I meant it." Caleb counted heads. 9 of us. That's more than I expected. Would have been more, but someone needs to stay behind and keep watch. If Hale decides to make a move while we're gone, we need people here to sound the alarm. Tom glanced at the cabin, then back at Caleb. "You got food for the trail?" "Enough. Mara packed enough supplies for an army." The young woman Caleb didn't recognize stepped forward. She was maybe 25, with auburn hair pulled back under a wide-brimmed hat and eyes that assessed everything with sharp intelligence. She wore men's work clothes and carried herself with the easy confidence of someone comfortable in the saddle. "Mr. Ward, I'm Rebecca Mallory. My father owns the Triple M Ranch about 15 miles north. He couldn't make the ride, bad leg from an old injury, but he wanted someone from our family here to represent our interests." Caleb nodded acknowledgement. "You know what you're getting into, Miss Mallory? This might get rough before it's over." Rebecca's smile was thin. "Mr. Ward, I've been running my father's ranch since I was 18. I've dealt with claim jumpers, cattle thieves, and more than my share of men who thought a woman couldn't handle ranch business. I think I can manage whatever comes next." "Fair enough." Caleb turned to address the group. "Listen up, everyone. It's a hard 2 days to Cheyenne, maybe longer if the weather turns. We're going to push as fast as we can without killing the horses. When we get there, we find this clerk Mara mentioned, Thomas Garrett, and we get him to examine these deeds. If he confirms they're forgeries, we get written testimony from him, and we bring it back to Sheriff Morrison. Questions?" "What if Garrett won't help?" Samuel Tucker asked. "Or what if he's been paid off by Hale?" Mara spoke up. "Garrett's reputation is built on honesty and accuracy. He's exposed fraud before, and from what I've heard, he's not the kind of man who can be bought. But if for some reason he won't help us, we'll find someone else who will. Cheyenne has a federal land office. There are people there who can verify these documents." "And if the documents turn out to be legitimate?" Mary Hartley's voice was quiet. "What then?" The question hung in the cold air, and no one answered it immediately. Finally, Caleb said, "Then we figure out our next move. But I don't think they're legitimate, and I don't think any of you really believe they are either. Hale's pattern is too clear, his timing too convenient. We're going to prove he's a fraud, and we're going to stop him." The certainty in his voice seemed to steady the group. They mounted up, and Caleb took point with Mara riding beside him on a borrowed horse from the Brennan Ranch, a sturdy bay that could handle the hard miles ahead. The sun was just breaking over the mountains as they rode out, 9 riders united by necessity and determination. They made good time that first day, following the main trail east through the valley and then up into the foothills. The weather held clear and cold, the horses fresh, and the group settled into a rhythm of riding and brief rests that ate up the miles without wearing out their mounts. They stopped at midday to water the horses and eat a quick meal of jerky and hardtack, then pushed on through the afternoon. It was during the second rest stop, with the sun beginning its descent toward evening, that Charlie Brennan rode back from where he'd been ranging ahead as a scout. "Riders behind us," he announced, his young face tight with concern. "Maybe 3 miles back, moving at about the same pace we are." Caleb and Tom exchanged glances. "How many?" Caleb asked. 4, maybe 5. Hard to tell with the distance and dust." "Could be coincidence," Dutch said, but his tone suggested he didn't believe it. Mara's expression had gone hard. "Or Hale sent men to follow us, to see where we're going, who we're talking to. Or to make sure we don't reach Cheyenne at all," Rebecca added. The possibility settled over the group like a cold shadow. They were a day's ride from Clearwater and still a full day from Cheyenne, exposed on the open trail with no real cover if someone wanted to cause trouble. "We keep moving," Caleb decided, "but we stay alert. Charlie, you and Dutch take turns ranging behind us. If those riders get closer, I want to know immediately. Everyone else, keep your weapons ready, but out of sight. No sense advertising that we're worried. They rode on with new tension crackling through the group. The afternoon stretched into evening, and when they finally made camp in a sheltered hollow near a creek, Charlie reported that the following riders had stopped as well, maintaining their distance but clearly still tracking them. They built a small fire for coffee and warmth, but kept it banked low, not wanting to make themselves too visible. Guards were posted in shifts, 2 at a time, watching the back trail in the surrounding darkness. Caleb took the midnight watch with Mara, both of them silent as they listened to the night sounds and watched for movement that didn't belong. "I'm sorry," Mara said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "For what?" "For bringing this trouble to you, to all of you. If I hadn't spoken up in that meeting, if I just stayed quiet, then Hale would be stealing this land right now, and none of us would have a chance to fight back." Caleb kept his eyes on the darkness. "You did the right thing. Whatever comes next, it's not your fault. You don't know what he's capable of. In Kentucky, a rancher who tried to fight him ended up dead in what they called a hunting accident. Another family's barn burned down the night before they were supposed to meet with a lawyer. Hale doesn't just use legal tricks. He uses fear and violence when he has to. Then we'll be ready for it." Mara turned to look at him, her face barely visible in the dim starlight. "You've changed. Since I first walked into your cabin, you've changed. Maybe I was tired of being dead while I was still breathing." She was quiet for a moment. Sarah must have been remarkable to inspire this kind of loyalty even 3 years after she's gone. Caleb felt the familiar ache in his chest, but it was different now. Not the crushing weight it had been, but something more like a distant sadness, the way a healed wound still remembers the injury. She was stubborn and opinionated and absolutely certain about what was right and wrong. She would have hated what Hale's doing, would have been the first one organizing this ride to Cheyenne. Then I wish I could have known her. She would have liked you, would have appreciated your fight. They lapsed back into silence, watching and waiting, and when their shift ended and Tom and Rebecca took over, Caleb lay in his bedroll thinking about Sarah's face and Mara's determination and the strange way life had of pulling you back into itself even when you thought you were done with living. The second day of riding brought clouds rolling in from the west and a wind that cut through even the thickest coat. The riders behind them maintained their distance, never closing the gap, but never falling away either. The group pushed harder, knowing that whoever was following them would have to show their hand eventually, and preferring that confrontation to happen somewhere near civilization rather than in the empty country they were crossing. By late afternoon, they crested a rise and saw Cheyenne spread out below them. A real city compared to Clearwater, with streets laid out in a grid, substantial buildings of brick and stone, and the evidence of railroad money transforming the frontier into something more permanent. Smoke from dozens of chimneys rose into the gray sky, and even from a distance they could hear the sounds of commerce and construction. "There," Tom said with obvious relief. "Now let's see if Hale's men are stupid enough to follow us into town." They rode down into the city as the first snowflakes began to fall, the horses tired but still sound. The streets were busy with evening traffic. Freight wagons, carriages, riders heading home or to saloons, people hurrying through the cold. Caleb led the group to a livery stable on the eastern edge of town where they could board the horses, and from there they split up to find lodging. "We'll meet at the Silver Dollar Hotel in an hour," Caleb instructed. "That'll give everyone time to get settled. Then we find out where Thomas Garrett lives and see if we can talk to him tonight." The group dispersed, and Caleb found himself walking through the unfamiliar streets with Mara beside him. They secured 2 rooms at a modest boarding house, separate, respectable, though Caleb noticed the knowing look the landlady gave them anyway. Small town or city, people always assumed. An hour later, reassembled at the Silver Dollar, they began asking questions. The hotel clerk directed them to a clerk at the land office who pointed them toward a residential street on the north side of town. Thomas Garrett, it turned out, lived in a small but well-maintained house within walking distance of the territorial offices where he'd worked for 2 decades. Night had fallen fully by the time they found the address. Warm light showed through the windows, and smoke rose from the chimney. Caleb knocked, and after a moment the door opened to reveal a man in his 60s, thin and scholarly-looking, with wire-rimmed spectacles and ink stains on his fingers. "Can I help you?" Thomas Garrett asked, looking at the crowd on his porch with obvious confusion. "Mr. Garrett, my name is Caleb Ward. We've come from Clearwater with some documents we need you to examine. Documents we believe are forgeries being used to steal ranch land. Garrett's expression sharpened with interest. Forgeries? That's a serious accusation. We know. That's why we need someone with your expertise to verify what we suspect. The clerk hesitated, then stepped back from the door. Come in, then. But leave the crowd. I don't have space for all of you. 2 representatives should be enough. Caleb entered with Mara, while the others waited outside in the cold. Garrett's house was exactly what Caleb expected. Books everywhere, papers organized in neat stacks, a desk covered with maps and documents. This was a man who lived in a world of records and details, who probably knew more about Wyoming Territory's land transactions than anyone alive. They sat at his dining table, and Caleb produced the deed Hale had distributed in Clearwater. Garrett took it with careful hands, holding it up to the lamplight and examining it with the same intensity a jeweler might examine a suspected fake diamond. This claims to be signed by James Whitmore, he said after a long moment. That's right, dated September 1872. Whitmore did serve as land commissioner during that period. Garrett pulled a magnifying glass from his desk and studied the signature more closely. But this isn't his signature. The words hit the room like a thunderclap. Mara leaned forward. You're certain? Absolutely. I worked with Jim Whitmore for 8 years before he retired. I've seen his signature hundreds of times. This is a competent forgery, I'll grant you. Whoever did it studied the general shape and flow of his writing. But look here. He pointed to specific letters with the tip of a pen. The capital W in Whitmore. Jim always made the middle point slightly higher than the outer points, a quirk of his penmanship he developed after breaking his wrist in 1868. This signature has all 3 points level. And see how the R connects to the E? Jim never connected those letters. His arthritis made it difficult, so he always lifted the pen between them. Caleb felt something fierce and triumphant rising in his chest. What about the seal? Garrett examined it next, his frown deepening. This is trickier. The seal itself is genuine, or at least it's an authentic territorial seal from the right period. But the impression is wrong. Too deep, too clean. Official seals get used constantly, which means they develop wear patterns, slight irregularities in the impression. This looks like it was made with a new seal, or one that hadn't seen much use. Could it have been stolen from Whitmore's office after he retired? Mara asked. Possibly. When Jim left the office, there was supposed to be an inventory of all official materials, including seals. But things get overlooked, especially during transitions. If someone had access to the office after his death last year, they could have taken his seal and used it on forged documents. Garrett set the paper down and looked at them both over his spectacles. Where did you get this document, and how many others like it exist? Caleb explained the situation in Clearwater, Hale's claims, the threatened ranches, the pattern of fraud that Mara had recognized from Kentucky. Garrett listened with growing anger, his scholarly demeanor giving way to something more personal. This isn't the first time, he said when Caleb finished. I've seen this before, though never on this scale. Land fraud has been a problem in every territory. Men who forge documents, bribe officials, or simply take advantage of poor record-keeping to claim land that isn't theirs. But most of them are small-time operators. What you're describing sounds much more sophisticated. Victor Hale is very sophisticated, Mara said bitterly. He's been doing this for years, probably across multiple territories. He knows exactly how to work the system, how to make his forgeries look legitimate enough to fool anyone who doesn't know what to look for. Garrett stood and began pulling books and folders from his shelves. If you want to stop him, you're going to need more than my word. You'll need documentation, official testimony, proof that can hold up in court. I can provide that, but it will take time to prepare properly. How much time? Caleb asked. A day? Maybe 2. I'll need to pull comparison samples of Whitmore's genuine signature, write up a detailed analysis of the forgery, and prepare an affidavit that can be submitted to the territorial court. I'll also send a telegram to the current land office to verify that no such transaction was recorded in the official ledgers. If Hale really purchased these land rights, there should be a record beyond just this deed. Can you do all that without alerting whoever might be working with Hale? Mara asked. We suspect he has connections, maybe people who've been paid to look the other way. Garrett's smile was grim. I've been working in land records since before most of these supposed officials were born. I know who's honest and who's not. I'll be discreet. They talked for another hour, going over details and making plans. Garrett would begin his investigation first thing in the morning. In the meantime, Caleb and the others would stay in Cheyenne and try to gather any additional evidence they could find. Other families who might have been targeted by Hale, officials who might know about his operations, anything that could strengthen their case. When they finally left Garrett's house, stepping out into the falling snow, the rest of the group was waiting in a nearby saloon, huddled around a table nursing coffee and whiskey. "Well?" Tom Brennan asked as soon as they entered. "He confirmed it," Caleb said, and the relief that swept through the group was almost physical. "The signature is forged. The seal is likely stolen. Garrett's going to prepare official testimony, but it'll take a day or two." "So we wait," Samuel Tucker said. "We wait, and we watch our backs. Those riders who followed us from Clearwater are still out there somewhere, and Hale's going to know we're not just sitting idle." The next morning brought continued snow and a city moving at the slower pace that winter imposed. Caleb and several others went to the Territorial Land Office to ask questions and review public records, while Mara and Rebecca visited other saloons and hotels, trying to find anyone who might know about Hale's operations or had encountered similar schemes. What they found was troubling. Over the course of the day, they uncovered 3 other families who'd lost land in the past year to what they'd believed were legitimate claims, only to discover later that the documents were suspect, but by then the land had already been sold to third parties who claimed to be innocent purchasers. The pattern was consistent and damning. Hale would acquire land through fraud, then quickly flip it to someone else, creating a legal tangle that made it nearly impossible for the original owners to recover their property. "He's not just stealing land," Rebecca said that evening as they gathered again in the Silver Dollar. "He's building a network of transactions that protect him. Even if we prove his documents are fake, he'll argue that the land has already been legally transferred to someone else who had no knowledge of the fraud." "So we go after those third parties too," Dutch said. "Make them give the land back." Mara shook her head. "It's not that simple. If they can prove they purchased the land in good faith, believing Hale's title was legitimate, the law might protect them even if Hale was a fraud. We could win the battle and still lose the land." The realization settled over them like a weight. They'd come to Cheyenne hoping that proving the forgery would be enough, but Hale had built layers of protection, legal shields that might let him escape even if they exposed him. "Then we don't just prove the forgery," Caleb said. "We prove the pattern. We find every piece of land he's claimed, every document he's filed, every transaction he's made. We show that this isn't one mistake or one questionable deed. This is systematic fraud. And we make sure that everyone who's bought land from him knows they're holding stolen property." It was ambitious, maybe impossible, but it gave them a direction. They spent the next day and a half working with Garrett and digging through public records, building a case that grew more damning with each discovery. Garrett's analysis of the forged signature was meticulous and devastating. The telegram he'd sent to the land office confirmed that no such transaction had been officially recorded, and the pattern of Hale's land claims showed a clear progression, starting small with isolated ranches, then expanding to larger operations, always moving quickly to resell before questions could be raised. On the 3rd day, Garrett finished preparing his affidavit and supporting documentation. It was a thick packet of papers, each page carefully annotated and cross-referenced, building an undeniable case that the deeds Hale had presented were forgeries based on a stolen seal and a dead man's forged signature. "This should be enough for any honest judge to throw out Hale's claims," Garrett said, handing the packet to Caleb. "But you need to understand, if Hale has the connections you suspect, he'll fight this with everything he has. He'll bring in lawyers, he'll challenge every detail, he'll try to drag this out until you run out of money or patience." "Let him try," Caleb said. "We're not backing down." They prepared to leave Cheyenne that afternoon, eager to get back to Clearwater before the week deadline expired. But as they were settling their accounts at the boarding house, Charlie Brennan came running in, his face flushed with exertion and alarm. "Trouble," he gasped. "Those men who followed us, they're at the livery. Tried to spook our horses, cut some of the saddle straps. The stable owner caught them at it, and there was a fight. One of them pulled a gun." Caleb was moving before Charlie finished speaking, the others right behind him. They reached the livery to find the stable owner, a big man named Garrett, who handled a pistol with the ease of long practice, holding 3 men at gunpoint while a fourth lay on the ground bleeding from what looked like a gunshot wound to the leg. "These your friends?" the stable owner asked Caleb. "Never seen them before, but they followed us from Clearwater." The 3 standing men were rough-looking types, the kind who hired out for dirty work and didn't ask questions. But the one on the ground was different, better dressed, with the look of someone who'd been giving orders rather than taking them. Caleb knelt beside the wounded man. "Who sent you?" "Go to hell. You're bleeding badly. That leg needs a doctor, or you're going to lose it. Or worse. Tell me who sent you, and I'll make sure you get medical attention." The man's face was pale, sweating despite the cold. He looked at his 3 companions, then back at Caleb, calculating his odds. Finally, he spoke. "Hale. Victor Hale. Paid us to follow you, see where you went and who you talked to. We weren't supposed to hurt anyone, just sabotage your gear, slow you down. And report back to him what we were doing. Yeah, he's got a telegraph man in his pocket. We were supposed to wire him from Cheyenne with whatever we learned." Caleb stood. "Did you send that telegram?" The wounded man's silence was answer enough. "Then Hale knows we found Garrett. He knows we have evidence." Caleb looked at the others. "We need to ride. Now. If Hale knows what we've learned, he's either going to run or he's going to make a move on the ranches while we're still gone." They left within the hour. The wounded man turned over to local authorities along with statements about what had happened. The ride back to Clearwater was harder and faster than the journey out, pushing the horses to their limits. They rode through the night, stopping only briefly to rest the animals, driven by the knowledge that every hour they delayed gave Hale more time to act. Dawn of the 4th day found them within sight of Clearwater, the town appearing out of the morning mist like a promise or a threat. Caleb expected to see smoke rising from the ranches, signs of trouble or violence. Instead, the valley looked peaceful, almost normal. But as they rode into town, they saw a crowd gathered outside the sheriff's office. And standing on the steps, looking satisfied and official, was Victor Hale with his lawyer Edmund Price beside him. Sheriff Morrison stood in the doorway, his expression conflicted and angry. When he saw Caleb and the others approaching, he stepped forward. "Caleb, I'm glad you're back. We've got a situation." "What kind of situation?" Hale answered before the sheriff could. "The kind where the law catches up with those who make false accusations and interfere with legitimate business, Mr. Ward. You and your friends have been very busy in Cheyenne, I understand, making wild claims, spreading lies about my character and my business practices." Caleb dismounted, his hand instinctively checking that his rifle was accessible. "Everything we said about you is true, and we have proof." "Proof?" Price stepped forward with a paper in his hand. "What you have is the testimony of a retired clerk with a grudge against land speculators. What I have is a writ from a federal judge ordering the immediate transfer of the disputed properties to my client, pending final resolution of the ownership questions. Which means that as of this moment, you and the other ranchers are trespassing on Mr. Hale's land." The words hit like a physical blow. Caleb saw the same shock on the faces of Tom, Samuel, Mary, and the others. They'd gone to Cheyenne, they'd found proof, they'd done everything right, and somehow Hale had still outmaneuvered them. "That's not possible," Mara said, her voice shaking with fury. "You can't get a writ that fast, not without the other side having a chance to present evidence." "I can when I have a judge who understands the importance of protecting property rights," Hale said smoothly. "Judge Carmichael in Cheyenne was very sympathetic to my case, especially when I explained how a group of squatters was trying to use forged testimony to discredit legitimate land claims." "You're lying. Judge Carmichael wouldn't what?" "Uphold the law. I'm afraid you've overestimated the power of your evidence, Mrs. Whitfield. Or should I say Miss? I'm not sure you were ever actually married, though you've used different names in different territories, haven't you?" The accusation was meant to discredit her, and Caleb saw it land. Some of the townspeople in the crowd shifted uncomfortably, doubt creeping into their expressions. Hale was good at this, at turning the narrative, at making himself the victim and his accusers the villains. But before anyone could respond, a new voice cut through the tension. "Actually, Judge Carmichael did no such thing." Everyone turned to see Thomas Garrett stepping out of the crowd, and beside him was a man Caleb didn't recognize. Older, distinguished-looking, with the bearing of someone accustomed to authority. Garrett continued, "Because I took the liberty of bringing these documents directly to the territorial governor's office. And Governor Campbell was very interested to learn about a federal judge issuing writs based on what appear to be fraudulent land claims. This is Governor Campbell's legal counsel, Mr. Richard Thorne. He'd like to examine the writ you're holding, Mr. Price, and he'd like to know which federal judge supposedly issued it." Price's confidence flickered. Hale's face went pale, then flushed with rage. The lawyer started to speak, but Thorne cut him off. "That writ is a fake, isn't it? Just like the land deeds. You were betting that these ranchers wouldn't have time to verify its legitimacy before you used it to seize their property. But you made one mistake. You underestimated how far they'd be willing to go to fight back." The crowd's mood shifted in an instant. Sheriff Morrison moved down the steps, his hand on his gun. "Hale, Price, I'm taking you both into custody pending investigation of these fraud allegations. You have the right to—" Hale moved fast for a man his age, pulling a small pistol from his coat. But he wasn't aiming at Morrison or Caleb. He was aiming at Mara. "You," he snarled, "you've cost me everything. You should have stayed in Kentucky and mourned your pathetic father quietly. Instead, you had to chase me halfway across the country, had to ruin—" The shot that rang out didn't come from Hale's gun. It came from Caleb's rifle, fired from the hip in one smooth motion, the bullet striking Hale's hand and sending the pistol flying. Hale screamed and grabbed his bleeding hand, and in the chaos that followed, Sheriff Morrison and Dutch tackled both Hale and Price to the ground. The crowd erupted into shouts and movement, but Caleb only had eyes for Mara. She stood frozen, staring at the spot where Hale had been standing, her face white with shock. "You all right?" Caleb asked. She nodded slowly. "He was going to kill me." "Not while I'm standing here." She looked at him then, really looked at him, and something passed between them. Recognition, gratitude, and something deeper that neither was quite ready to name. Sheriff Morrison hauled Hale to his feet, blood dripping from the man's shattered hand. "Lock them both up," he ordered his deputy, "and send for the territorial marshal. This is bigger than Clearwater can handle alone." As Hale was dragged away, still shouting threats and denials, Governor Campbell's counsel approached Caleb and the other ranchers. "You've done good work here," Thorne said. "The evidence you gathered, the testimony from Mr. Garrett, it's going to help us build a case not just against Hale, but against the entire network of fraud he's been running. We've been investigating land speculation schemes for months, but we could never get witnesses willing to come forward or evidence solid enough to prosecute. You've given us both." Tom Brennan stepped forward. "What about our ranches? The writ might be fake, but Hale's claims are still on file. Those claims will be invalidated as soon as we get this in front of an honest judge, which will be tomorrow if I have anything to say about it. In the meantime, you all continue operating your ranches as you always have. Anyone who tries to remove you will answer to the territorial governor's office." The relief that swept through the group was profound. They'd won. Against all odds, against a sophisticated criminal with resources and connections, they'd actually won. But as the crowd began to disperse and the ranchers gathered to celebrate, Caleb noticed Mara slipping away toward the edge of town. He followed her, finding her standing alone near the creek that ran behind the main street, her arms wrapped around herself against the cold. "You should be celebrating," he said gently. "I keep seeing my father's face, thinking about how he died, believing Hale had beaten us, believing there was no justice to be had." Her voice broke. "He should be here to see this." Caleb stood beside her, letting the silence settle around them. After a moment, he said, "You honored him. By not giving up, by tracking Hale across the country, by being willing to testify even when it put you in danger. Your father may not be here to see Hale face justice, but he'd be proud of what you did." "Would Sarah be proud of what you did?" The question caught him off guard, but he considered it seriously. "I think so. I think she'd say it's about time I stopped hiding and started living again." Mara turned to face him. "What happens now, after all this is settled and the ranches are secure and Hale's in prison?" "I don't know," Caleb admitted. "I hadn't thought past winning the fight." "Your 3 days are long past. Copper's healed. I could leave, head west like I originally planned." "You could." He held her gaze. "Or you could stay. Help me rebuild that ranch. Make it into what it should have been all along." "As what?" Your ranch hand? As my partner, if you're willing. The offer hung between them, weighted with possibility and hope and the strange alchemy that had transformed two broken people into something stronger together than they'd ever been apart. Mara searched his face, looking for doubt or hesitation, but finding only honest intention. I'm willing, she said finally, but on one condition. What's that? We plant new trees along the creek, start fresh, build something that's ours, not just a memorial to what's been lost. Caleb felt something loosen in his chest, some knot of grief and isolation finally beginning to unravel. Deal. They walked back to town together, and when they rejoined the celebration at the saloon, no one seemed surprised to see them side by side. The fight for the land was over, but the work of rebuilding, both the ranch and themselves, was just beginning. And for the first time in 3 years, Caleb Ward looked toward the future and felt something other than emptiness. He felt hope. The celebration in the saloon lasted well into the night, but Caleb and Mara slipped away before midnight, riding back to the ranch under a sky so clear the stars seemed close enough to touch. The cold air carried the sharp clarity that came after crisis, when the body finally acknowledged how close it had come to disaster and responded with a strange combination of exhaustion and exhilaration. Neither spoke much during the ride. There was too much to process, too many emotions running just beneath the surface. When they reached the ranch, Mara went to check on Copper while Caleb tended to Sable, and they met again in the cabin where the fire had burned down to embers. Caleb rebuilt it while Mara made coffee, and they sat at the table like they had that first night, though everything between them had shifted in ways neither could have predicted a week ago. Richard Thorne said the hearing is tomorrow at 2 o'clock, Mara said, wrapping her hands around her cup, in front of Judge Harrison at the Territorial Courthouse in Clearwater. He seemed confident. Confident that Hale's claims will be thrown out, or confident that Hale will actually face consequences? Both, I think, but Caleb... She paused, choosing her words carefully. Hale's not the kind of man who goes down quietly, even locked up, even with his hand shattered and his lawyer probably looking for a way to save himself. Hale will have tricks left. He always does. Caleb had been thinking the same thing during the ride home. Men like Hale didn't build criminal empires without backup plans and escape routes. The writ had been fake, yes, but it had been a good fake. Good enough to fool most people at first glance. What other forged documents might Hale have prepared? What other officials might be in his pocket? Tomorrow we'll know, Caleb said. One way or another, it ends tomorrow. But sleep that night was elusive for both of them, and when dawn came gray and cold with the promise of more snow, they were both already awake and moving through the early morning routines that had become familiar over the past week. Caleb found himself watching Mara as she worked, noticing small things, the efficient way she moved, the careful attention she gave to even mundane tasks, the strength that showed in every gesture. She'd been shaped by loss just as he had, but where he'd retreated into isolation, she'd transformed her grief into purpose. They rode into Clearwater 2 hours before the hearing, joining a steady stream of ranchers and townspeople all heading toward the courthouse. The building stood on the north end of town, a 2-story structure of red brick that served as the seat of territorial justice for the entire region. By the time they arrived, a crowd had already gathered outside, not just the ranchers whose land had been threatened, but curious townspeople, journalists who'd gotten wind of a major fraud case, and even a few federal officials who'd come from Cheyenne with Governor Campbell's counsel. Sheriff Morrison stood at the courthouse door with 2 deputies, checking names against a list and trying to maintain some semblance of order. When he saw Caleb and Mara, he waved them through. Judge Harrison wants all the principal witnesses inside early, Morrison explained. That's you two, Tom Brennan, Samuel Tucker, Mary Hartley, and Thomas Garrett. The rest will have to wait for general seating. They entered a courtroom that smelled of wood polish and old paper, with high windows that let in thin winter light. The judge's bench sat elevated at the front, flanked by territorial and federal flags. Rows of wooden benches filled the space, already half occupied by lawyers, officials, and early arrivals who'd claimed the best seats. Victor Hale sat at the defense table with Edmund Price beside him, though Caleb noticed immediately that the dynamic had changed. Price looked haggard, his expensive suit rumpled, and he kept a careful distance from his client. Hale's right hand was wrapped in bandages, his face pale and drawn, but his eyes still held that predatory intelligence. When he saw Mara enter, his expression twisted with pure hatred. "All rise for the Honorable Judge Marcus Harrison," the bailiff called out, and the room stood as one. Judge Harrison was a man in his early 60s with steel gray hair and a face that had seen too many liars and criminals to be easily fooled. He took his seat with the deliberate movements of someone who understood the weight of his position and took it seriously. "Be seated," he said, his voice carrying easily through the courtroom. "We're here to address multiple claims of land fraud brought against Victor Hale and Edmund Price, along with criminal charges including forgery, conspiracy, and attempted murder. This is a preliminary hearing to determine if there's sufficient evidence to proceed to trial." "Mr. Thorne, you're representing the territorial government?" Richard Thorne stood. "Yes, Your Honor. The territory has compelling evidence that Mr. Hale has engaged in systematic fraud using forged documents to illegally claim ownership of ranch land throughout this region." "And Mr. Price, you're representing the defense?" Price rose slowly, and Caleb saw the man's hands trembling slightly. "Your Honor, I need to make a statement before we proceed." Hale's head snapped toward his lawyer, alarm flashing across his face. "Edmund, what are you about—" "Be quiet, Mr. Hale," Judge Harrison said sharply. "Mr. Price, proceed." Price took a breath, then spoke in a voice that grew stronger as he continued. "Your Honor, I was retained by Victor Hale 6 months ago to handle various land transactions in Wyoming territory. At the time, I believed I was engaged in legitimate legal work. However, in light of recent revelations and after reviewing the evidence gathered by Mr. Garrett and the ranchers, I can no longer in good conscience defend Mr. Hale's actions. I'm prepared to testify for the prosecution regarding documents and transactions I now believe to be fraudulent." The courtroom erupted. Hale lunged at Price, screaming obscenities, but the bailiff and deputies were on him immediately, forcing him back into his seat. Judge Harrison's gavel cracked like a gunshot. "Order! I will have order in this court." Harrison waited until the noise subsided. "Mr. Price, do you understand that your testimony may implicate you in criminal activity?" "I do, Your Honor, and I'm willing to accept consequences for my participation, unwitting though it was. But I will not continue to perpetrate fraud on this court or these citizens." Harrison nodded slowly. "Very well. You'll need separate counsel. Bailiff, find Mr. Price a public defender for consultation. Mr. Hale, do you wish to retain new counsel, or will you represent yourself?" Hale's face had gone from pale to flushed, his eyes wild. "This is a travesty. My own lawyer corrupted by these liars and their false evidence. Mr. Hale, I asked you a simple question. Do you want a lawyer or not? I want justice. I want these people arrested for making false claims against a legitimate businessman. I'll take that as choosing to represent yourself, which I strongly advise against, but it's your right." Harrison turned to Thorne. "Counselor, present your evidence." What followed was 3 hours of meticulous testimony that built an overwhelming case against Hale. Thomas Garrett took the stand first, explaining in precise detail how he'd analyzed the forged signature on the land deeds, comparing it to authentic samples of James Whitmore's writing. He brought in enlarged photographs showing the differences in penmanship, the inconsistencies in the seal impression, and the suspicious uniformity of documents that supposedly had been created months apart. "The signature is forged, Your Honor," Garrett concluded. "I would stake my professional reputation on it. Moreover, I've confirmed with the Territorial Land Office that no such transactions were ever officially recorded. If Mr. Hale truly purchased these land rights, there should be corresponding entries in the official ledger. There are none." Hale tried to cross-examine, but his questions were rambling and desperate, easily deflected by Garrett's calm expertise. Judge Harrison grew visibly impatient with Hale's tactics. Next came testimony from families in Kentucky who'd lost land to Hale using identical methods. 3 people had made the journey to Wyoming specifically to testify, and their stories painted a damning pattern. A widow who'd lost her family farm. A young couple whose ranch had been seized weeks after they'd buried their infant daughter. An elderly man who'd spent his life savings fighting Hale in court, only to lose because the forged documents looked more official than his authentic but old land grant. Mara took the stand after them, and Caleb watched her transform before the court. Gone was any hint of uncertainty or doubt. She spoke clearly and forcefully about her father's ranch, about watching Hale destroy her family with the same forged documents and legal manipulation he was attempting in Wyoming. When Hale tried to interrupt, claiming she was lying out of spite, Judge Harrison silenced him with a look that could freeze water. Mrs. Whitfield has more credibility in her little finger than you've shown in this entire proceeding, Mr. Hale. You'll have your chance to present a defense when the prosecution finishes. Until then, keep quiet. Tom Brennan, Samuel Tucker, and Mary Hartley all testified about the impact of Hale's claims on their ranches and families. Their words were simple but powerful. These were people who'd worked the land for decades, who'd built lives and livelihoods through honest labor, now facing ruin because of one man's greed. The turning point came when Edmund Price took the stand after consulting with his new counsel. The lawyer looked like he'd aged 10 years in the past few hours, but his testimony was clear and devastating. Mr. Hale hired me to file land claims and handle legal documentation, Price said. He provided me with deeds that he claimed had been properly acquired through the Territorial Land Office. I performed due diligence, or what I thought was due diligence, verifying the seals and signatures against samples I was given. What I didn't know was that those samples were also forged, created specifically to make the fraudulent documents appear legitimate when compared. When did you realize something was wrong? Thorne asked. When Mr. Garrett showed me authentic samples of James Whitmore's signature, and I saw they didn't match what I'd been given. That's when I understood I'd been used as an unwitting accomplice in a fraud scheme. Did Mr. Hale ever explicitly tell you the documents were forged? No, he was careful about that. But looking back, there were signs I should have questioned more carefully. The speed with which he wanted to process claims, his insistence that we avoid certain official channels, the way he always had cash ready to pay filing fees rather than using bank drafts or checks that would leave a paper trail. Hale could contain himself no longer. He stood, pointing an accusing finger at Price. You're a traitor and a liar. I trusted you with legitimate business, and you're destroying me to save your own skin. Mr. Hale, sit down, Harrison commanded. I will not sit down while this travesty. Bailiff, remove Mr. Hale from this courtroom. We'll continue without him. The deputies moved in, but Hale fought back, his wounded hand apparently forgotten in his rage. It took 3 men to wrestle him toward the door, and as they dragged him past Mara, he spat in her direction. This isn't over. You think you've won, but I have friends. I have resources. What you have, Judge Harrison said coldly, is a one-way trip to territorial prison pending trial on multiple felony charges. Get him out of here. The courtroom doors slammed behind Hale's retreating screams, and a collective breath seemed to release from everyone present. Harrison took a moment to compose himself, then turned back to the assembly. Given Mr. Hale's behavior and the evidence presented, I'm making several immediate rulings. First, all land claims filed by Victor Hale in Wyoming Territory are hereby declared null and void. The deeds are fraudulent, the transactions never occurred, and the affected ranchers retain full legal ownership of their properties. Second, I'm issuing a warrant for Mr. Hale's arrest on charges of fraud, forgery, conspiracy, and attempted murder. Third, I'm ordering a full investigation into every land transaction Hale has been involved with in this territory, with restitution to be made to any other victims we uncover. Mr. Thorne, I assume the territorial government will handle that. Yes, Your Honor. We're already compiling a list of potentially affected properties. Good. As for Mr. Price, while I appreciate your cooperation, you'll still face charges related to your role in filing fraudulent documents. However, I'm inclined toward leniency given your willingness to testify. Expect probation and disbarment rather than prison time, assuming your continued cooperation. Price nodded, looking relieved despite the professional ruin awaiting him. Is there anything else that needs to be addressed today? Harrison asked. Caleb stood. Your Honor, what about Hale's other victims? The families from Kentucky who lost land to him. Is there any way to help them recover what was stolen? Harrison's expression softened slightly. That's outside my jurisdiction, Mr. Ward, but I'll be sending a full report of these proceedings to the Kentucky Territorial Courts, along with all the evidence we've gathered. It won't be easy. If Hale sold that land to third parties, untangling the legal mess will take years. But this verdict and the evidence supporting it should give them a much stronger foundation for their cases than they had before. It wasn't everything, but it was something. Caleb glanced at Mara and saw tears streaming down her face, not from sadness, but from a release of pressure that had been building for months. Her father would never see justice, but other families might because of what she'd done, because she'd refused to let Hale's crimes go unchallenged. If there's nothing else, Harrison said, this hearing is concluded. The formal trial will be scheduled within 60 days, though given the evidence, I expect Mr. Hale will be advised to accept a plea agreement. This court is adjourned. The gavel fell one final time, and the courtroom exploded into motion. Ranchers embraced each other, journalists rushed to file their stories, and officials gathered to discuss the next steps. Caleb made his way to Mara, who stood alone near the witness stand, still crying. "You did it," he said quietly. "Your father would be so proud." She turned into his embrace without hesitation, and he held her while she cried out months of grief and rage and determination that had carried her across half a continent. Around them, people celebrated and made plans, but in that moment, they existed in their own small sphere of shared understanding. Tom Brennan approached after a few minutes, his weathered face split by a huge grin. "Drinks are on me at the saloon. Everyone's invited. We're celebrating the fact that we still have our ranches and that son of a bitch is behind bars where he belongs." The gathering that followed was different from the tense meeting a week ago. This was genuine celebration. Ranchers who'd been facing ruin now secure in their ownership, families who'd been living in fear now able to plan for the future. The saloon filled to capacity, and Sheriff Morrison had to post deputies outside to keep the peace as the party spilled into the street. Caleb found himself surrounded by neighbors he'd avoided for 3 years, all of them wanting to shake his hand and thank him for standing up to Hale. He accepted the gratitude awkwardly, still not comfortable being the center of attention, but something had shifted in how he related to these people. They weren't just the folks who lived nearby anymore. They were allies who'd fought beside him, who'd trusted him to help lead them through a crisis. "You know what this means, don't you?" Samuel Tucker said, approaching with a glass of whiskey in hand. "You're part of this community now, whether you like it or not. Can't go back to hiding in that cabin and pretending the rest of us don't exist." Caleb smiled despite himself. "I suppose not." "Good. Because we're going to need your help rebuilding. Not just fixing fences and clearing land, but organizing ourselves so something like this can't happen again. We need a ranchers association, regular meetings, someone to keep track of legal issues and property rights. Someone like you." The suggestion was both flattering and terrifying. Caleb had spent 3 years trying to disappear, and now he was being asked to take on leadership responsibilities for the entire valley. "I'll think about it," he said, which was more commitment than he'd have made a week ago. Across the room, Mara stood with Mary Hartley and Rebecca Mallory, the 3 women deep in conversation. Caleb watched them and felt that strange sense of possibility again, not just for himself, but for what they'd all built together in the past week. A community that had been fragmented and vulnerable had found its strength. People who'd been isolated had discovered they were stronger together. As the afternoon wore into evening and the celebration showed no signs of slowing, Caleb slipped outside for some air. The street was quieter here, away from the saloon's noise, and the setting sun painted the western sky in shades of orange and red. He was standing there watching the light fade when Mara joined him. "Not much for crowds?" she asked. "Never have been. You?" "I learned to tolerate them, but I prefer quiet." She stood beside him, close enough that their shoulders almost touched. "Caleb, I've been thinking about what comes next." His heart sank slightly. She was going to leave. Despite their conversation by the creek, despite the partnership they'd agreed to, she was going to keep moving west, keep running from memories that hurt too much to face. "Your father's ranch," he said. "You want to go back to Kentucky, see if you can reclaim it." "Actually, no. I got a telegram this morning, before the hearing, from a lawyer in Louisville who heard about the case. He said that based on the evidence gathered here, he thinks he can build a case to invalidate Hale's claim on my family's land. It won't be quick, and it won't be easy, but there's a real chance now." "That's good news." "It is, but here's the thing. I don't want that ranch back." She turned to face him fully. "That land is full of ghosts and grief. My father died there. My mother died there years before that. Everything I remember from that place is wrapped up in loss. If we can get the land back, I'm going to sell it and use the money to help other families Hale victimized. Start a fund for legal fees. Hire lawyers to fight the cases that haven't been resolved yet. Caleb studied her face in the fading light. What will you do instead? I thought I might help a stubborn rancher rebuild his neglected property. Plant some trees by a creek. Make something new instead of trying to resurrect something dead. Her eyes searched his. If the offer's still open, the relief that flooded through him was profound. The offer's open, more than open. Good, because I'm not much for uncertainty these days. I need to know where I stand. You stand right here, with me, for as long as you want to stay. Mara smiled, the first genuine smile he'd seen from her since that morning in the cabin when she'd offered to earn her keep. Then I guess you're stuck with me, Caleb Ward. I can think of worse fates. They stood together as the sun finished setting and the first stars appeared, and Caleb felt something settle in his chest that had been restless for 3 years. Not the old happiness he'd known with Sarah. That was gone and couldn't be reclaimed. But something new, built on different foundations. A partnership forged in crisis. A connection made stronger by the very struggles that could have broken them. Inside the saloon, someone started playing a fiddle, and the celebration took on new energy. But Caleb and Mara stayed outside, content to let the noise remain background to their own quiet moment of understanding. We should get back to the ranch, Mara said eventually. Early start tomorrow if we're going to begin those repairs we identified. About that, Caleb said. I was thinking we might take a day or two first. Rest. Process everything that's happened. Maybe plan out what we actually want to build instead of just fixing what's broken. Planning ahead? That's not very like you. Maybe I'm changing. Maybe we both are. They collected their horses and rode home under a sky brilliant with stars, the valley spread out below them peaceful and secure. When they reached the ranch, Caleb realized he'd been thinking of it differently, not as the place where Sarah had died, but as the place where he and Mara would build something new. Mara headed for the barn, but Caleb called out to her. There's a second bedroom in the cabin. Hasn't been used in 3 years, but it's warmer than the barn. And given everything that's happened, everything we're planning to do together, it seems strange to have you sleeping out there. She paused, considering. Are you sure? I don't want to intrude on your space. You're not intruding. You're my partner. Partners don't sleep in barns. All right then. Let me settle copper, and I'll bring my things in. Later, as Caleb banked the fire and Mara arranged her few belongings in the spare room, the cabin felt alive in a way it hadn't since Sarah's death, not haunted by the past, but inhabited by the present, full of possibility and new beginnings. Caleb? Mara's voice came from the doorway of her room. Yeah? Thank you. For everything. For believing me, for fighting beside me, for giving me a reason to stop running. Thank you for walking into my kitchen uninvited and refusing to let me stay dead inside. She laughed softly. Is that what I did? That's exactly what you did. And I'm grateful for it. They said goodnight and retired to their separate rooms, but Caleb lay awake for a while longer, listening to the sounds of another person in the house, remembering what it felt like to be part of something larger than his own isolation. Tomorrow they'd start rebuilding in earnest. Tomorrow they'd begin the work of transforming a neglected ranch into a thriving partnership. Tomorrow, they'd plant the first of those trees by the creek, literal and metaphorical symbols of new growth. But tonight, for the first time in 3 years, Caleb Ward went to sleep feeling like the future held promise instead of just empty days stretching toward an inevitable end. The fight for the land had been won. The courtroom battle had ended in victory, and now the real work could begin. Not fighting against something, but building toward something. In the territorial prison in Cheyenne, Victor Hale sat in a cell and plotted appeals and reversals that would never come. His empire of fraud had collapsed, his carefully constructed network of corruption exposed, his freedom gone. But in a cabin in a Wyoming valley, 2 people who'd been broken by his crimes were discovering that healing was possible, that justice sometimes prevailed, and that even the deepest grief could give way to hope if you were brave enough to let it. The stars wheeled overhead, indifferent to human dramas of loss and redemption. The creek ran cold and clear, waiting for spring and the trees that would soon line its banks. And in the warmth of a fire-lit cabin, 2 people slept peacefully, dreaming of the life they were going to build together from the ashes of everything they'd lost. The morning after the hearing dawned clear and impossibly bright, the kind of day that made everything seem freshly created. Caleb woke to the smell of coffee brewing and the sound of someone moving quietly in the kitchen, a sound he'd heard only once before in 3 years, that first morning when Mara had made breakfast as payment for shelter. But this time felt different. This time she wasn't a stranger working off a debt. She was home. He dressed quickly and emerged from his room to find Mara at the stove, scrambling eggs in the cast-iron skillet that had sat unused for months. She'd pulled her dark hair back in a loose braid, and morning light through the window caught the profile of her face, highlighting the determined set of her jaw and the slight smile that played at the corners of her mouth. "You're up early," Caleb said. She glanced over her shoulder. "Couldn't sleep past dawn. Too much energy, I think. After months of chasing Hale and weeks of fighting, my body doesn't know what to do with peace." "I know the feeling." He poured himself coffee and leaned against the counter. "What do you want to tackle first today?" Mara divided the eggs onto 2 plates and brought them to the table. "I was thinking we should walk the entire property. Not to assess damage this time, but to actually plan. Figure out what we want this place to be 5 years from now, 10 years from now, then work backward from that vision to what we need to do today." It was such a simple idea, but it struck Caleb with unexpected force. For 3 years he'd been living day to day, surviving rather than building toward anything. The concept of having a 10-year plan, of imagining a future that far ahead, felt both foreign and exhilarating. "All right," he agreed. "After breakfast, we walk." They ate quickly, the food simple but satisfying, and then bundled up against the cold and headed out into the crystalline morning. The ranch spread before them like a canvas waiting for paint. The meadow where Sarah had dreamed of expanding their hay production, the ridge where Caleb had once planned to build a larger barn, the creek that ran year-round and could support so much more than it currently did. They started at the northern boundary and worked their way south, Mara taking notes in a small journal she'd pulled from her saddlebag. She asked questions Caleb hadn't considered in years. How many cattle could the land support if they improved the grazing rotation? Where would be the best location for a vegetable garden that could feed them year-round? Which fence lines needed to be moved to create more efficient pastures? "You're thinking like a real rancher," Caleb observed as they stopped near a stand of cottonwoods. "I am a real rancher, or I was before Hale, and I plan to be again." She gestured toward the creek. "This is where we should plant the trees, along both banks, spaced about 20 feet apart. In 10 years, they'll provide shade for livestock in summer and a windbreak in winter. In 20 years, they'll be a legacy." Caleb looked at the creek, trying to see it through her eyes, not as it was now, but as it could be. "What kind of trees?" "Cottonwoods like these, maybe some willows for variety. They grow fast and their roots will help stabilize the banks during spring runoff." She turned to face him. "But I meant what I said about this being symbolic, too. New growth, fresh starts, something we plant together that will outlive both of us." "When do we start?" "Soon as the ground thaws enough to dig. Another month, maybe 6 weeks if we're lucky with the weather." They continued their survey, and with each section of land they discussed, Caleb felt the fog that had surrounded him for 3 years lifting further. Mara's enthusiasm was infectious, her vision clear and practical. She didn't just dream, she planned, calculated, figured out the steps between current reality and future possibility. By midday, they'd covered most of the property and filled several pages of Mara's journal with notes and sketches. They were standing on the ridge overlooking the cabin when they heard the sound of approaching horses. Caleb's hand moved instinctively toward his rifle, old wariness dying hard. But then he recognized Tom Brennan's distinctive gray gelding leading a group of riders up the trail. Tom, Charlie, Samuel Tucker, Mary Hartley, Rebecca Mallory, and Dutch all dismounted in the yard, their faces serious despite the victory they'd celebrated the day before. "Didn't expect to see you all so soon," Caleb called down from the ridge. "We've got news," Tom shouted back. "Both good and complicated. You might want to come hear this." They made their way down to where the group had gathered near the cabin. Mary Hartley looked like she'd been crying, but whether from joy or distress was impossible to tell. Tom held a telegram in his hand, the thin paper fluttering in the breeze. "What happened?" Mara asked. Tom handed her the telegram. Came this morning from the territorial governor's office. Turns out Hale's fraud was even bigger than we thought. They've been going through his records and files since the arrest, and they've identified over 30 properties across 4 territories that he illegally claimed using forged documents. 30? Caleb repeated, stunned by the scale. At minimum. Could be more. But here's where it gets complicated. Some of those properties were sold to third parties who claim they bought them in good faith. The territorial government is trying to sort out who gets restitution and how, but it's going to take years of legal work. Mara's hand tightened on the telegram. Does this mention Kentucky? My father's ranch? Rebecca stepped forward, her expression gentle. There's a second telegram, Mara. It came addressed to you care of Caleb's ranch. She handed over another slip of paper. Mara read it silently, her face going through a series of emotions Caleb couldn't quite interpret. Finally, she looked up, and he saw tears streaming down her cheeks. The lawyer in Louisville used the evidence from Wyoming to reopen my father's case. The Kentucky courts have declared Hale's claim on our ranch invalid. The land officially reverts to my family, to me, as of today. Her voice broke. I got it back. After everything, I actually got it back. The group erupted in congratulations and embraces, everyone talking at once. But Caleb watched Mara's face and saw something more complex than simple joy. Relief, yes, and vindication, but also uncertainty, and maybe even fear. When the excitement died down, Samuel Tucker spoke up. There's one more thing. The territorial government is offering compensation to all the ranchers who were threatened by Hale's fraud. Not a huge amount, but enough to help with improvements and recovery. They're also establishing a land registry system to prevent this kind of fraud in the future, and they want to use our Ranchers Association as a model for other territories. We don't have a Ranchers Association, Caleb pointed out. Not yet. But we're forming one, and you're going to help lead it. Tom's tone made it clear this wasn't a request. After what you did, standing up to Hale when the rest of us were too confused or scared to act, people trust you. We need that trust to build something that'll protect all of us going forward. The responsibility settled on Caleb's shoulders like a physical weight, but this time he didn't try to shrug it off. These people had fought beside him. They deserved leadership that wouldn't abandon them. All right, he said, I'll help, but I'm not doing it alone. Mara's got more experience with land law and property rights than any of us. She should be part of the leadership too. All eyes turned to Mara, who was still holding the telegram about her family's ranch. She looked at Caleb, then at the assembled group, and something in her expression shifted from uncertainty to determination. I'd be honored, she said, but I need to tell you all something first. I'm going back to Kentucky. The words hit Caleb like a physical blow. Around him, he heard murmurs of surprise and disappointment, but all he could focus on was the sudden hollow feeling in his chest. She was leaving. Despite everything they'd talked about, despite the partnership they'd agreed to, she was going back to the land of her grief and her ghosts. Mara must have seen something in his face because she quickly added, not permanently, just for a few weeks, maybe a month. There are legal documents I need to sign, decisions I need to make about the property. And she paused, her voice growing softer. I need to visit my father's grave. Tell him we won, that Hale is paying for what he did. I need that closure before I can really move forward. The relief that flooded through Caleb was almost embarrassing in its intensity. When do you leave? End of the week, if I can arrange transportation. I'll take the train from Cheyenne. She looked around at the group. But I'll be back. This is home now. This is where I'm building my future. Mary Hartley stepped forward and took Mara's hands. You do what you need to do, honey. We'll be here when you get back. And if you need help with anything, travel expenses, someone to ride with you to Cheyenne, anything at all, you just say the word. Thank you, all of you. Mara's voice was thick with emotion. You took a stranger's word about a criminal you'd never heard of, and you trusted me enough to risk everything fighting him. I won't forget that. The group began to disperse after making plans for a formal meeting to establish the Ranchers Association. As they rode away, Charlie Brennan lingered behind, approaching Caleb with the awkward determination of youth. Mr. Ward, I wanted to thank you for letting me come to Cheyenne. My pa says I learned more about courage and standing up for what's right on that trip than I could have learned in a year of regular living. Caleb put a hand on the young man's shoulder. You did good work, Charlie. Kept watch, stayed alert, didn't panic when things got dangerous. Your father should be proud. He is, and he says maybe next season if you need help with your ranch, I could hire on for summer work. Learn from you and Miss Whitfield how to run a place properly. We'll see. Lot of work to do before we're in a position to hire hands, but I'll keep it in mind. Charlie rode off with a grin, and Caleb turned back to find Mara standing on the porch, watching him with an expression he couldn't quite read. What? He asked. You're good with people, better than you think you are. That boy worships you, you know. He's just excited about the adventure we had. No, it's more than that. You showed him what it looks like to stand up for something that matters, to fight for your community even when it's hard. That's the kind of lesson that shapes a life. Caleb climbed the porch steps to stand beside her. Mara, about Kentucky, I know what you're thinking, that I'm going to get there and decide to stay, to rebuild my father's ranch instead of coming back here. Are you? She turned to face him fully, her dark eyes serious. 3 weeks ago, I would have said yes without hesitation. That ranch was my whole life, and losing it nearly destroyed me. But now... She gestured at the land spread out before them, at the cabin and barn and creek. Now I see what I couldn't see before. That place in Kentucky is the past. All my memories there are wrapped up in grief and failure. But this place, your place, our place, this is possibility. This is the future I want to build. Then why go back at all? Because I need to say goodbye properly. To my father, to the life I had, to the girl I was before Hale stole everything. I need to close that chapter completely so I can start this new one with a clear heart. She reached out and took his hand. But I am coming back, Caleb. I promise you that. He believed her. More than that, he understood her need for closure. He'd never gotten to say a proper goodbye to Sarah. She'd slipped away in the night while he slept, exhausted from 3 days of caring for her through the fever. He'd lived with that incompleteness for 3 years, and it had nearly broken him. Then we'll make the most of the time before you leave, he said. Get as much planning done as possible so we can hit the ground running when you return. The next 4 days passed in a blur of activity. They finalized plans for the spring planting, ordered supplies that would be delivered while Mara was gone, and made arrangements with Tom Brennan to check on the property in Caleb's absence, because he'd decided to ride with Mara to Cheyenne and see her safely onto the train. On the morning of departure, Caleb saddled both horses while Mara packed her few belongings. Copper was fully healed now, ready for the journey, and the chestnut mare seemed to sense her owner's excitement. Mara moved through the cabin one last time, touching surfaces and looking at spaces as if memorizing them. I'll only be gone a month, she said when she caught Caleb watching. Why does it feel like I'm leaving for years? Because the last time you left somewhere, you couldn't go back. Your brain's reminding you what loss feels like. That's probably true. She closed her saddlebag and turned to him. Promise me you'll keep working on the plans while I'm gone. Don't let yourself slip back into isolation just because I'm not here. I promise. And I'll have help. Tom's already volunteered to come by twice a week, and Rebecca Mallory asked if she could consult with me about irrigation systems for her father's ranch. Rebecca asked that, did she? Mara's tone was teasing. She's a smart woman and single, and you're not exactly hard to look at. Caleb felt his face heat. It's not like that. She's just interested in ranch management techniques. If you say so. Mara's smile was knowing. But Caleb, I want you to understand something. When I come back, and I will come back, I'm not expecting you to have waited around doing nothing. If you meet someone while I'm gone, if you find happiness somewhere else, I'll understand. There's nowhere else I want to find happiness. The words came out more forcefully than he intended. I waited 3 years to feel alive again, Mara. I'm not going to waste another minute of that life on anyone but you. She crossed the space between them and kissed him, quick and fierce, then pulled back before either of them could deepen it into something that would make leaving harder. Hold that thought for a month, she said. Then we'll see where it leads. They rode to Cheyenne in 2 days, stopping overnight at a way station that offered separate rooms and curious looks from the proprietor. The train station in Cheyenne was crowded with people coming and going, the great iron beast of the locomotive hissing steam and smoke as it prepared for departure. Caleb helped Mara with her luggage, and they stood on the platform as other passengers boarded, neither quite ready to say goodbye. "I'll write when I get to Louisville," Mara said. "Let you know how everything's going with the legal proceedings." "I'll write back. Tell you about the progress here. And if anything happens, if there's trouble with Hale's associates or problems with the ranch, I'll handle it. You just focus on what you need to do there." The conductor called for final boarding, and Mara picked up her bag. She started toward the train, then stopped and turned back. "Caleb, do you remember that first night when you found me in your cabin cooking dinner?" "I remember. You could have thrown me out, called the sheriff, treated me like the trespasser I was. But you gave me a chance instead. You gave me hope when I'd nearly run out of it. Everything that's happened since, fighting Hale, saving the ranches, getting my father's land back, none of it would have been possible without that first act of kindness. You're the one who saved the ranches. I just provided backup. We saved them together. That's what partners do." She smiled, and it was the warmest, most genuine smile he'd ever seen from her. "1 month, Caleb Ward. Then we start building the rest of our lives." She boarded the train, and Caleb watched through the window as she found a seat. The locomotive's whistle shrieked, and the great wheels began to turn, slowly at first, then faster. Mara raised her hand in farewell, and Caleb waved back, standing on the platform until the train disappeared around a distant curve. The ride back to Clearwater was the longest 2 days of Caleb's life. The landscape that had felt full of promise when Mara was beside him now seemed empty and quiet. But he'd made her a promise not to retreat into isolation, so when he reached home, he immediately threw himself into work. He spent the first week repairing fence posts, the physical labor helping to quiet the restless energy that came from missing someone. Tom Brennan rode over twice as promised, and they worked together on clearing the irrigation ditches, preparing for spring runoff. Rebecca Mallory did indeed visit to discuss water management, and Caleb found her company easier than he'd expected. She was direct and knowledgeable, with none of the awkwardness that sometimes came when people tried too hard to be friendly. "Mara's smart to stake her claim on you," Rebecca said one afternoon as they examined a particularly tricky section of ditch that needed rerouting. Caleb nearly dropped his shovel. "What makes you think she's staked any kind of claim?" Rebecca laughed. "Please, I saw how you two looked at each other during the trial and at the celebration after. That's not the way partners in ranch management look at each other. That's the way people who found something precious look at each other. We're not yet, but you will be. Anyone with eyes can see it coming." She straightened up, brushing dirt from her gloves. "I'm happy for you both. You deserve it after everything you've been through." Letters from Mara arrived weekly, delivered to Clearwater and brought to the ranch by whoever was passing by. She wrote about the legal proceedings that were moving faster than expected, about visiting her father's grave and finding a kind of peace she hadn't anticipated, about discovering that the lawyer handling her case was the son of a man her father had helped years ago, a debt of kindness being repaid across generations. Caleb wrote back about progress on the ranch, about the Ranchers Association taking shape with Tom as president and him as vice president, about plans for the spring cattle drive in the garden Mara had sketched out that he was preparing to plant. His letters were shorter than hers, less eloquent, but he tried to put into words the truth he was still learning to speak, that he was grateful for her presence in his life, that he was counting the days until her return. 3 weeks into her absence, a telegram arrived that sent Caleb's heart into his throat. It was from Mara, just 4 words. "Coming home, stop early." She arrived 5 days later on the afternoon train, and Caleb was waiting at the station with both horses. When she stepped off onto the platform, he barely recognized her. She'd bought new clothes, a split riding skirt and fitted jacket that looked both practical and elegant. Her hair was styled differently, pinned up in a way that showed off the graceful line of her neck. But it was her face that struck him most. The shadows that had haunted her eyes were gone, replaced by something that looked like genuine peace. "You came early," he said as she approached. "Finished the legal work faster than expected. The ranch sale is finalized. The money transferred to the restitution fund I told you about. I paid my respects to my father and had a long conversation with his spirit about everything that's happened. And then I realized I was done there. Everything I want is here." She looked at him directly. "Everything." They rode home as the sun began its descent toward the western mountains, and Mara talked about her time in Kentucky. The closure she'd found, the weight that had lifted when she finally laid her father's memory to rest in a way that honored both his life and her need to move forward. Caleb listened and found himself telling her things he'd never told anyone, about the specific ways he still missed Sarah, about the guilt he'd carried for not being able to save her from the fever, about how loving Mara felt different from what he'd had with Sarah, but no less real. "I'll never be her," Mara said quietly as they crested the ridge overlooking the ranch. "I can't replace what you lost." "I don't want you to be her. I don't want a replacement for what was. I want something new, something built on who we both are now, not who we used to be." The ranch spread out before them in the golden light of evening, and Caleb saw it through new eyes. Not the graveyard of his dreams with Sarah, but the foundation of something he and Mara would build together. The cabin they would share, the land they would steward, the future they would create one day at a time. Over the following weeks, they fell into a rhythm that felt both comfortable and exhilarating. They worked side by side from dawn until dusk, repairing, improving, planning. When the ground finally thawed, they spent 3 days planting young cottonwood saplings along the creek banks, exactly as Mara had envisioned. Each tree was a promise, to each other, to the land, to the future they were building. The Ranchers Association held its first official meeting in early April, with representatives from 14 families crowding into the Brennan barn. Caleb and Tom presented a charter that outlined shared resources, mutual support during emergencies, and a system for monitoring land claims to prevent future fraud. The vote to ratify was unanimous. News came from Cheyenne that Victor Hale had been sentenced to 20 years in territorial prison, with restitution ordered for every family he'd defrauded. The amount would never fully compensate for what had been lost, but it was acknowledgement that justice sometimes prevailed, that the powerful couldn't always escape consequences. Spring turned to summer, and the ranch transformed under their combined efforts. The garden Mara had planned produced abundant vegetables. The cattle they'd purchased together with Caleb's savings and some of Mara's restitution money thrived on improved pastures. The young trees along the creek grew with surprising vigor, their green leaves a promise of the shade they'd provide in years to come. One evening in late June, as they sat on the porch watching the sun set behind the mountains, Mara reached over and took Caleb's hand. "I've been thinking," she said, "about what we're building here, about the future." "What about it?" "I want to make it official, not just the ranch partnership, but us. I want to marry you, Caleb Ward." He turned to look at her, his heart suddenly racing. "That sounds like a proposal." "It is. Unless you think it's too soon, or you're not ready, or—" He stopped her words with a kiss that had been building for months, ever since that moment in the courtroom when he'd realized he would do anything to protect her, to keep her in his life. When they finally broke apart, both breathless, he smiled. "Yes, absolutely yes." They were married in August by the circuit judge during his regular visit to Clearwater, with the entire ranching community in attendance. Tom Brennan stood as Caleb's best man, and Mary Hartley stood with Mara. The ceremony was simple and brief, held in the meadow beside the creek where their trees were already nearly 4 feet tall. When the judge pronounced them husband and wife, and Caleb kissed his bride under the vast Wyoming sky, he felt Sarah's presence not as a ghost demanding loyalty to the past, but as a blessing on the future. She would have liked Mara, would have approved of the way they'd fought together and built together and found healing in each other's company. The celebration that followed lasted well into the night, with food and music and laughter that echoed across the valley. But eventually the guests departed, and Caleb and Mara were left alone in the cabin that was now truly theirs. Not his or hers, but belonging to both of them equally. "What are you thinking?" Mara asked as they stood on the porch, watching the last riders disappear into the darkness. "That 3 months ago I was a dead man still breathing, convinced I'd never feel alive again. And now I'm married to the most stubborn, determined, remarkable woman I've ever met, and we're building something that matters. Life's strange. Strange good or strange bad? Strange, wonderful." She leaned against him, and he wrapped his arms around her, and they stood together listening to the night sounds of their ranch, the cattle lowing in the distance, the creek running over stones, the wind moving through the young trees they'd planted together. In the months and years that followed, the ranch prospered in ways Caleb had never imagined possible. They expanded the cattle operation, built a second barn, and established a breeding program that became known throughout the territory for producing quality stock. The Ranchers Association grew to include over 30 families, creating a network of mutual support that made everyone more resilient. Word spread about how they'd defeated Victor Hale, and other communities facing similar fraud reached out for advice. Mara became something of an expert on land rights and legal protections, traveling occasionally to consult with territories that were trying to prevent the kind of systematic fraud Hale had perpetrated. She always returned home with relief, happy to trade the role of expert for the simpler pleasures of ranch work and the life she'd built with Caleb. The trees they'd planted along the creek grew tall and strong, their roots reaching deep into the soil, their branches spreading wide to provide the shade Mara had envisioned. In their fourth summer together, Caleb built a bench beneath the largest cottonwood, and they often sat there in the evenings, watching the light change and talking about everything and nothing. 5 years after their wedding, Mara gave birth to a daughter they named Sarah Elizabeth, honoring both the wife Caleb had lost and the father Mara had loved. The baby had Caleb's gray eyes and Mara's dark hair, and she grew up running through meadows that her parents had reclaimed from neglect, playing beneath trees they had planted with their own hands. The cabin was expanded to accommodate their growing family, and 2 years after Sarah came a son they named James, after Mara's father. The children grew up hearing stories about the time their mother walked into their father's kitchen uninvited, and their father chose kindness over caution. They learned about Victor Hale and the fight to save the ranches, about community and courage, and the importance of standing up for what was right. Samuel Tucker passed away in his sleep at age 78, and Caleb helped his sons manage the division of his property and the continuation of his legacy. Mary Hartley remarried and moved to Cheyenne, but she visited often, always bringing presents for the children and stories about her new life in the city. Tom Brennan became grandfather to 7 grandchildren and frequently joked that he'd lived long enough to see Caleb Ward transform from a hermit into a pillar of the community. Victor Hale died in prison 12 years after his conviction, unrepentant to the end. When news of his death reached Clearwater, Mara felt nothing, not satisfaction, not relief, just a distant acknowledgement that a dark chapter had finally closed. She and Caleb rode to the creek that evening and sat on their bench beneath the trees, and she spoke about her father for the first time in months. "Do you think he'd be proud of what we built?" she asked. "I think he'd be amazed, and grateful that his daughter found a way to transform grief into something so beautiful. I couldn't have done it without you. We did it together. That's how the best things happen." The ranch continued to thrive, becoming one of the most successful operations in the territory. But success was measured not just in cattle sold or money earned, but in the strength of the community they'd helped build, in the children they raised to value honesty and hard work, in the legacy of trees and land and love they were creating for generations yet to come. On their 20th wedding anniversary, Caleb and Mara stood once again beneath the cottonwoods by the creek. The trees had grown massive, their trunks thick and gnarled, their branches creating a canopy that dappled the ground with shifting patterns of light and shadow. Their children, Sarah, now 15, and James, 13, were working in the upper pasture, learning the same lessons of ranch management their parents had mastered together. "Do you ever regret it?" Caleb asked. "Walking into that cabin all those years ago? The life you could have had if you just kept riding west?" Mara looked at him with eyes that still held the same fierce determination he'd seen that first night, tempered now by 2 decades of love and partnership and shared purpose. "Not for a single second. This life, this place, this is everything I was looking for without knowing it. My father used to say that home isn't where you come from, it's where you choose to stay and build. I chose this. I chose you. And I'd make the same choice every day for the rest of my life." Caleb pulled her close, and they stood together beneath the trees they'd planted, on the land they'd fought for, surrounded by the life they'd built from courage and hope, and the simple decision to trust each other when they'd both forgotten how to trust the world. The sun set in glorious shades of orange and gold, painting the valley in colors that seemed designed specifically for this moment. Somewhere in the distance, their children's voices carried on the wind, talking and laughing as they worked together the way their parents had taught them. The cattle grazed peacefully in pastures marked by fences that had been repaired and maintained through 2 decades of careful stewardship. The creek ran clear and cold, its banks held firm by roots that reached deep into the earth. This was the legacy they were leaving, not just land and livestock, but proof that broken people could heal, that justice sometimes prevailed, that love could grow in the spaces grief had carved out, and that the future was always worth fighting for if you were brave enough to believe in it. As darkness fell and the first stars appeared, Caleb and Mara walked back to the cabin hand in hand, the same way they'd walked together through every challenge and triumph of the past 20 years. Behind them, the trees stood sentinel, growing stronger with each passing season, living monuments to the day two strangers chose partnership over isolation and built something that would outlast them both. The frontier had a way of breaking people, but it also had a way of proving that sometimes the broken pieces could be reassembled into something even stronger than the original. Caleb Ward and Mara Whitfield had learned that lesson the hard way, and they'd spent 2 decades teaching it to everyone around them through the simple act of living their lives with courage, integrity, and unwavering commitment to each other and the land they loved. And in the end, that was enough. More than enough. It was everything.